Meeting to order of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Pursuant to the order of reference Thursday, February 6, 2020, Bill C-4, an act to implement the agreement between Canada, the United States of America, and the United Mexican States. So before we start with our witnesses, I'm sorry, Mr. Give me a second, Mr. Savard Tremblay.
Juste, comment ça marche? Si vous me permettez un mot simplement.
With your permission, I would simply like to say something before we get going. I would like to point out that we have the students from ANAP here, the School for Public Administration in Montreal, and the head of the class, Émile Trudel, who has been involved in Quebec politics in the past. Thank you so much for being here with us. I, in the past, did give classes to some of these people here in the past. So once again, we're giving you a type of class about our political institutions. Thanks so much for joining us.
Welcome. We hope that you enjoy the meeting, and we're always pleased to have visitors here. Today, for 5 minutes to my colleagues, we have with us Philippe Mela, the Legislative Clerk for the Committee and Legislative Service Directorate, and Nathalie Caron, Legislative Expert, to give us a few minutes of advice or comment as we are going to move into dealing with our NAFTA at some point or another in the next few days, just on the services that they can provide to committee members in drafting amendments and so on. So I will turn it over to you, sir.
So je vais commencer. So I will start. My name is Philippe Mela, as Ms. Gros just mentioned. I'm the legislative clerk for Bill C-4. You adopted a motion yesterday that determined what the dates are for the deadline for amendments and the clause-by-clause consideration of the bill. So I'm just going to be here to help you to analyze the resolvability of amendments if you have any. And the amendments will be drafted by my colleague, Nathalie Caron. So since you know me already from being here quite often, I'm going to let my colleague speak.
Bonjour, mon nom est Nathalie Caron.
Good day, I'm Nathalie Caron, and I'm the advisor for the legislative clerk at the House of Commons. For C4, I've been designated to draw up the amendments. So let me begin by saying that the work that we carry out for you is always on an individual and confidential basis, and it's nonpartisan. Anything that we share when it comes to the amendments with you is never shared with anyone except with your consent. What we suggest that you do to carry out amendments is to get in touch with us as quickly as you can so that we can quickly begin to draw up the changes you wish to propose. You needn't wait until you've got everything perfectly ready or a full set of instructions to give us. As soon as you're ready to give us a couple of instructions, please get in touch with us immediately so that we can get going. The process can take time depending on how complex your request is. This is why it's important that you give us your instructions quickly and in detail. Give us an idea of where you're headed, what your aim is, with a bit of background as well. That will certainly help us draw up the amendment to your liking. Our role is to take your instructions and turn them into legislative drafting that will lead to the results you're looking for. So we will analyze the situation and work with you. We will carry out a legal analysis of your instructions. If we pinpoint any problems, any snags, we'll try to tell you about them and give you alternative solutions. And then we'll start drawing up the text. That means that we will draw up a first draft. We'll give it to you for your approval. Once you've approved it, we translate and edit. There are a number of steps, as you can see. This is why it is of the highest importance to work with us as quickly as possible. That's the message I have for you. So please don't hesitate to get in touch with us, even if you're not ready to give complete or detailed instructions about your amendment. At least we could start to talk about it and give you some help.
contact information with the members? Good, thank you. Mr. Hoback.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation, and I appreciate the service. What's the normal turnaround time if we have something we want you to consider? Does it take a day or 2 days, 4 days? Just give us an idea. What is normal?
It always depends on the number of requests we have and on the complexity of the request. Some amendments, sometimes if it's to change, let's say, coming into force date, turnaround time is very quick. But if you're trying to do something complex in fiscal legislation, there is a long analysis to be done sometimes. And it's all also influenced by the volume. Sometimes we get like a crunch where we have many, many requests at the same time. So then it will take longer.
So in this situation where we've actually got a very fixed short time period to deal with this, if we were to come with an amendment, let's say in the middle of next week, would it possibly, how would that impact the ability for you to get the through?
Yeah, we'll do our best to deliver on time. That's always our goal.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Any further questions or comments? No. Well, thank you both very much for coming. We look forward to seeing more of you as the time passes. All right. Okay, so on to our witnesses. Thank you for your patience. As an individual, we have Michael Geist, Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law, Faculty of Law, University of Ottawa, and from the Canadian Sugar Institute, Sandra Marsden, President, and from the Centre de Investigation, Hector de la Cava, General Coordinator by video conference in Mexico City. And on behalf of Unifor, we have Angelo Di Caro, Director of Research. Welcome to all of you today. Mr. Geist, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you, Chair, and good afternoon. As you heard, my name is Michael Geist. I'm a law professor at the University of Ottawa, where I hold the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law, and I'm a member of the Centre for Law, Technology and Society. My areas of specialty include digital policy, intellectual property, privacy, and the Internet, and I appear today in a personal capacity representing only my own views. Now, as you know, the typical approach before committee on a bill study is to examine the bill, identify provisions to support and areas for amendment. In this case, however, what really matters is not what is in the bill, but what is not. Indeed, the most notable issues from a digital policy perspective won't be found in Bill C4. Rather, they are found in the new NAFTA itself, and they typically limit Canada's policy options for future reforms rather than require immediate legislative action. Now, I think this raises a significant challenge since the flawed aspects of the deal cannot, to my knowledge, be fixed in Bill C4. Rather, they require change in a trade agreement that has been largely presented as a take-it-or-leave-it deal. I'd briefly like to discuss 4 issues along these lines: copyright term extension, the cultural exemption, privacy and data protection, and internet platform liability. First, copyright term extension. The intellectual property provisions in the agreement raise some significant concerns, but none more so than the requirement to extend the term of copyright from the international standard of life of the author plus 50 years to life plus 70. The additional 20 years is a reform that Canada rightly resisted for decades. By caving on the issue, the agreement represents a major windfall that could run into the hundreds of millions of dollars for rights holders and creates the need to recalibrate Canadian copyright law to restore the balance. The independent data on copyright term extension is unequivocal. It results in less access to works, higher costs for consumers, and no incentive for new creativity. In the words of Paul Held, one of the leading researchers on the effects of term extension, it effectively represents a tax on consumers to the benefit of publishers with no obligation to benefit the public. Now, the copyright review that was conducted by the Industry Committee in the last Parliament conducted an extensive review into the issue and concluded that extension should only occur as part of a trade agreement ratification. In such a circumstance, it recommended establishing a registration requirement to obtain the additional 20 years of protection to mitigate against the disadvantages of term extension and increase the overall transparency of the copyright system. So copyright term extension does not appear in Bill C4 because the government, I think, smartly negotiated a 30-month transition period to address the issue. The government has not rushed into term extension, and it should take full advantage of the transition period to follow the copyright review recommendation by establishing the registration requirement for the additional 20 years. That would allow rights holders who want the additional protection to get it, while also ensuring that many other works enter into the public domain after their term has expired after life plus 50. Secondly, the cultural exemption. Now, much like the copyright term extension, there is no reference to the cultural exemption in Bill C-4, and that's because the cultural exemption doesn't require legislative reform. However, I'd argue that the exemption is one of the most poorly understood aspects of the agreement. Consistent with the government claims, the cultural exemption covers a broad range of sectors with a near-complete exemption for Canada. But while the government has emphasized its broad scope, it rarely speaks of Article 32.6 sub 4, which comes immediately afterward. That provision was the price of the exemption, and it permits the U.S. to levy retaliatory measures of equivalent commercial effect where Canada relies upon the exemption. The retaliatory measures provision means that the U.S. is entitled to levy tariffs or other measures that have an equivalent commercial effect in response to Canadian policies that would otherwise violate the new NAFTA if not for the exemption. Now, since the provision does not limit the response to the cultural sector, the U.S. can be expected to target sensitive areas in the Canadian economy, such as dairy or steel, in order to discourage the use of the exemption. That was the U.S. strategy when it recently responded to a French plan to levy a new digital tax, which led to plans to levy $2.4 billion in tariffs against French goods such as wine, cheese, and handbags. Now, how could that play out in a Canadian policy context? The recent Broadcasting and Telecommunications Legislative Review Panel report, the so-called Yale report, contains what I view as many ill-advised recommendations on regulating the internet and online news services such as news aggregators. Should the government adopt the broadcast panel recommendations on content, the U.S. would have a strong case permitting retaliation with measures of equivalent commercial effect. Panel proposals that may violate the new trade agreement include requirements to pay levies to fund Canadian content without full access to the same funding mechanisms enjoyed by Canadians, licensing requirements for internet services that may violate NAFTA standards, and discoverability requirements that limit the manner in which information is conveyed on websites and services. Now, I'll emphasize that I think this is bad policy that should be rejected. However, for the purposes of this review of the new NAFTA, note that the policy flexibility to enact reforms in this area is severely limited by the agreement, which establishes the possibility of retaliatory tariffs for cultural policy. Thirdly, privacy. The limitations of new Canadian policy also arises in the context of privacy and data protection. Now, unlike the cultural exemption, which permits violations of the treaty subject to potential retaliatory tariffs, on the issue of privacy, Canada would run the risk of being offside its commitment under the new NAFTA. Note again that there is no provision on point in Bill C-4. There's no need for one, since the new NAFTA prohibits certain privacy-related provisions rather than requiring them. For example, the new NAFTA includes a provision prohibiting data localization, which refers to measures requiring that data be stored in Canada. Now, the new NAFTA actually features a more restrictive provision than the one that is found in the CPTPP. There are some general exceptions that build in GATS-related rules, but the Canadian government will clearly be restricted in its ability to establish localization requirements under the agreement. The implications of this limitation are far-reaching. Consider the wide range of policy issues that we're grappling with respect to data right now, whether that's Canada's digital charter and the proposals for privacy and data reforms, concerns around data sovereignty, AI-related issues, and fears about the competitiveness of Canadian businesses in relation to Canadian data. Now, it's notable that the Canadian government itself has established localization requirements as part of its cloud computing policy. Indeed, there is a recognition that data localization may be needed in certain circumstances. Yet under this agreement, Canada is severely limited in terms of its ability to implement such requirements. The same is true on the issue of data transfers, as the new NAFTA limits our ability to restrict them as well. As we enter into discussions with the European Union about the adequacy of Canadian privacy laws, there are concerns that the data transfer provision could put Canada between a proverbial privacy rock and a hard place, with the EU demanding certain restrictions on data transfers and the new NAFTA prohibiting them. Now, finally, internet platform liability. A similar dynamic arises in the context of internet platform liability, which raises the question of what responsibility lies with internet companies for third-party content that is hosted on their sites. This issue captures large players such as Google and Facebook, alongside anyone that offers user comments or content. Once again, there is no provision on this issue in Bill C-4. Rather, the reason is that the new NAFTA restricts policy in the area rather than requiring a new provision. So the new NAFTA includes a legal safe harbor for internet intermediaries and platforms for content posted by their users. The rule is designed to provide the platforms with immunity from liability, both for the removal of content as well as for the failure to remove content. Now, contrary to some claims, the rule doesn't mean everything goes. Sites and services are still subject to court orders and enforcement of criminal law, and intellectual property rights enforcement is also exempted. However, there are some that argue that the responsibility of internet platforms should go further, with potential liability for failure to act, even in cases of harmful, albeit legal, content. That position raises important freedom of expression concerns and questions about how to balance free speech safeguards with protection from harm. The issue for review in C4 is not to debate where Canada should land on the issue. For example, the broadcast panel recommended liability for online harms even if the content is legal. Others, including myself, would argue that liability should rest with illegal content, but to create liability for legal content, freedom of speech. The key point here is that there is a policy debate to be had. And under the new NAFTA, Canada has effectively already committed to a position, one that restricts our ability to establish liability for third-party content. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Geist. On to the Canadian Sugar Institute. Ms. Marston, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I would like to share the views of Canada's sugar industry on the implementation of the new NAFTA, the Canada-United States-Mexico Trade Agreement. The Canadian Sugar Institute strongly supports timely ratification of the new agreement, but is also seeking assurances from government that vital Canadian Export Administration procedures are in place when the CUSMA enters into force this year. The CSI represents Canadian refined sugar producers on nutrition and international trade affairs. The industry has 3 cane sugar refineries in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, a sugar beet processing plant in Taber, Alberta, as well as 2 further processing value-added sugar-containing product operations in Ontario, one in Belleville and one in Scarborough. Canadian refined sugar and sugar-containing products exports remained constrained by U.S. quotas that were actually established in the 1980s. These quotas were not liberalized under the NAFTA nor the WTO. In fact, those agreements further restricted our access to the U.S. market rather than liberalized it. And our industry suffered the pain of that through the closure of the Winnipeg sugar beet factory in Manitoba, as well as a cane sugar refinery in St. John, New Brunswick. So the CSI strongly supported the renegotiation of the NAFTA as a new opportunity to perhaps restore some of that access and gain some new, more flexible rules. Unfortunately, the CUSMA did not achieve the industry's objectives for substantial market access gains, but it did preserve existing access. Of course, during this negotiation, we often weren't sure whether we would lose ground rather than gain it, and it did create 2 new small quotas. The existing access that has been maintained includes 10,300 tons of beet sugar from Alberta, processed from Alberta sugar beets, and just over 59,000 tons of sugar-containing products. These are products high in sugar, like tea mixes and other drink mixes, hot chocolate, gelatin desserts, those kinds of products. And those products are produced in Eastern Canada with sugar refined in Montreal and Toronto. Now, these quotas are very small in relation to the 11 million ton U.S. sugar market, but they are critically important to an industry that's constrained by foreign trade barriers. The 2 new U.S. quotas that are in the CUSMA include a 9,600 ton beet sugar quota, which is exceedingly important to southern Alberta, approximately doubling the current access, and a new 9,600 ton quota for sugar-containing products. Now that's small in relation to the existing 59,000 tons, but it does bring with it more flexible rules that will allow the volume to be fully utilized. The problem with the existing quota is that the restrictive rules of origin and end-use limitations haven't kept pace with changes in the marketplace. So that quota has been reduced by about 25%, or at least the utilization by about 25% since 2006. The Canadian sugar refining and sugar-containing product operations in Eastern Canada have suffered this loss in the order of $11.5 million and 10,000 tons. Now, coming back to administration, the value of these quotas to Canada depends on the method that Canada chooses to manage the export administration. Export controls are the firmly established method for managing access into restricted high-value markets in the NAFTA and, for example, in the CIIT. They are necessary to provide predictability, to enter into supply contracts with U.S. customers, to maintain supply chains, and to justify ongoing investment in those further processing sugar-containing product operations. So we've consistently advocated for export controls alongside our market access objectives in trade in the CUSMA trade negotiations, as we did in the prior TPP negotiations. And we have now received assurances that Canada will in fact implement export controls, and the issue will be a question of timing. It's important that these procedures be in place before the CUSMA is implemented, otherwise the value will not transfer to our industry. So a public consultation has been planned, and we've been informed that this will be an omnibus consultation that will extend beyond the CUSMA quotas to existing U.S. quotas as well as the CITA origin quotas. Our concern is that this not, of course we support public consultation, our concern is that this not delay the necessary implementation of export controls and allocation to companies for the new CUSMA quotas. So we're seeking further assurances that there isn't any necessary delay, that Canada notify the U.S. immediately upon ratification of the CUSMA, that Canada will use export controls because there is a requirement in the CUSMA that Canada do so 150 days prior to U.S. acceptance of those export permits at entry. So that there won't be border enforcement this year, but at the very least it should be in place by the beginning of the second year in 2021. There's no need to consult on the beet sugar quota because the only sugar that qualifies for that is produced and processed in Alberta. For the sugar-containing products, which is the key issue for our industry, the allocation procedure should be allocated to those companies that have made and sustained investments in Canada, that have historically and actively participated in those quotas, and that have suffered the volume and financial losses. So essentially that's the members of the Canadian Sugar Institute that do the sugar refining and the associated sugar-containing product operations. 92 to 95% of the U.S. quota is filled by our members. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Marsden. On to Mr. De La Cueva by video conference from Mexico City. We're going to go to Mr. De Caro.
Please, yeah, okay. I'll explain. So when we were first invited, we also asked if Hector could join us and split our time. And so that's what we've decided to do. So we'll do 5 minutes and 5 minutes, and that will make up Unifor's time. I only learned about the extra 10 minutes today, so there's too late to fill in the blanks on the comments in a way. So if you'll indulge me, then we'll go to Hector. So I'll say good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. As was said, my name is Angelo De Caro. I'm the National Director of Research for Unifor. Unifor is Canada's largest union in the private sector, representing more than 315,000 workers in nearly every industry from coast to coast to coast. I want to thank the committee for the invitation to speak today on Bill C-4 and the implementation of CUSMA, and bring greetings from our National President Jerry Dias and National Secretary Treasurer Lana Payne. I also want to thank the committee for allowing me to share this time with Hector De La Cueva, a friend and an ally of our unions, who is with us on video conference from Mexico City. Hector is the General Coordinator of the Mexican Center for Labor Research and Trade Union Advisory, and he has been a key point of contact for us throughout these NAFTA negotiations. I want to open my remarks by stating what's probably the obvious. NAFTA has been a very challenging deal for working people with many negative effects over time. It was an agreement built to limit democratic controls over trade and investment and tie the hands of government policymakers. was one of the first agreements to establish private tribunals that investors could use to challenge Canadian regulations and potentially sue governments for unlimited sums of money. It conceded sovereignty of Canada's energy production to the United States. And despite the obvious competitive pressures that free trade would put on workers in all three countries, NAFTA and its negotiators simply paid no mind. A generation later, we've seen the outcome: a manufacturing trade deficit with Mexico that's ballooned from $3.5 billion at its onset to more than $27 billion today, half of that in the auto sector alone, including parts. We've seen a workforce pressured by wage cuts and threats of job loss to low-wage right-to-work states or Mexican export processing zones. And if you want examples, you don't have to look too far, considering the recent struggles we faced in NEMAC, in Essex, and of course our fight with General Motors assembly operations in Oshawa. These job dislocations happen largely because of NAFTA. They happen because businesses have unconditional access to markets. It's why companies can sell here, but can have no obligation to build here. So in light of that, it's almost impossible for our union to be fully satisfied with the outcomes of CUSMA. Uniform members in Kitimat and in Saguenay, for instance, are rightly upset about the unequal treatment the aluminum sector received regarding content rules for automobiles, a problem that needs addressing. Our members in softwood lumber industry are still disadvantaged by unfair duties on exports, deepening our already challenged forest industry. But while we're paying close attention to these concerns, there are, without a doubt, important advances in this deal, led by Minister Freeland and her team, that deserve support. In CUSMA, for the first time, tariff-free auto trade is now conditional on high-wage production. It's not a silver bullet, but it is a new tool to help stop the bleeding of investment to low-wage factories and an attempt to incentivize an upward pressure on low-wage production. In CUSMA, for the first time, Canada has scrapped its Investor State Dispute Settlement System, or ISDS. This is very good. And frankly, we would encourage the federal government to go one step further in its implementation efforts and direct the removal of ISDS from all other trade agreements that Canada currently has. The CUSMA also reclaims our energy sovereignty. It maintains a cultural carve-out and reverses course on certain bad cultural policies enacted under the Harper government. Most importantly, it establishes important fixes to pre-existing language and groundbreaking new provisions that address workers' rights, provisions that have been made even stronger thanks to recent changes outlined in the Protocol of Agreement. CUSMA's labor provisions not only exceed the terms of the original NAFTA, but they exceed provisions in any trade agreement negotiated ever since, provisions that I personally would have thought impossible to achieve even 3 years ago. Now, we are not naive to think that CUSMA by itself fixes the deeply entrenched anti-worker practices in Mexico. If anyone thinks that, then they don't have a clear read of the problem in Mexico. The implementation of this agreement must come with clear commitments that Canadian officials will work with their Mexican counterparts to finance rights-based community support projects and fully resource a proactive, investigative approach to the rapid response mechanism. All of this must be done in consultation with trade unions and worker advisor groups in Mexico, like Hector's. So with that, I'll pass the rest of my time over to Hector for his comments.
Okay. Mr. De La Cueva, it's your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelo, and thank you to the chair and members of the committee for having me speak today. I have traveled to Canada many times, but it's very cold, especially in winter. So I appreciate you allowing to communicate from Mexico City, where it's much warmer. The spring became early for us. I have spent much of my life working with the independent trade union movement here in Mexico, and I have seen the damage caused by a system of undemocratic trade unionism and fake collective bargaining. In Mexico, under NAFTA, real wages have fallen over 25 years. This despite major advances in productivity and trade. I share the concern raised by Uniform. There is a lot in the new CUSMA that reflects the old NAFTA, an agreement that aimed to exploit my country for its low-wage workers and its natural resources, and reproduced inequalities between the countries and inside the countries. Mexico's relationship to North America is a low-cost supplier of goods and services that keeps more than 50% of Mexican living in poverty. And while Mexicans suffer, Canadian workers suffer too, with job losses and threats of low wages. In NAFTA, workers do not win. I will say, like Angelo, that there are important advances in CUSMA on labor rights. This is perhaps its positive aspect. The new agreement has already had an immediate consequence on promoting long overdue labor reforms in my country. This includes provisions to ensure democratic participation in union organizing and collective bargaining. In Mexico, many workplaces are controlled by so-called protection contracts. It means collective agreements established by employers and supported by unelected unions. In Mexico, these powerful unelected union officials are installed as worker representatives on tripartite committees like arbitration boards, guaranteeing that workers have no voice. The new rapid response mechanism for monitoring compliance is stronger than any measure we have seen before. And we hope it will allow us to better challenge this system of corruption that breeds unfair trade. But these enforcement tools should not be used only as a weapon to attack Mexico. Instead, they should apply fully to all parties of CUSMA, including Canada. In Mexico, the main problem we face has not been our national laws or ratification of international agreements. Having strong laws designed to protect workers and preserve human rights mean nothing if states or corporations simply ignore them. The new CUSMA enforcement measures include significant penalties for corporations who break the rules. This is encouraging. That is something we have not seen before. But sometimes, US and Canadian-based companies are the ones that ignore their obligations to labor and human rights. And that must stop as well. To be truly effective, the labor provisions in CUSMA must be used as a tool to attack corporate injustice and social inequality, not simply a tool to attack Mexico. I am very pleased to have met with Canada's chief negotiator and other officials during the negotiation process. If you can believe it, we had an easier time arranging meetings with Canadian officials than our own trade officials here in Mexico. I want to thank those who spoke to us and heard our concerns for their openness. I thank you again for allowing me to speak and would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much for your contribution. We will now start with committee members. Mr. Lewis, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much to the witnesses for coming here today. Allow me to open by saying that we are the party of free trade, and it is not in our interest to hold it up by any stretch of the imagination. But, you know, families, workers, and businesses, they depend on it. But without all the information at our fingertips, such as an economic impact study, we have to do our due diligence. Specific to, this question is for Mr. DeCaro. The clause that requires 40% of cars produced in Mexico be completed by workers making at least $16 an hour or $20 Canadian. On the surface is good news for auto workers in Canada and obviously for workers in my riding of Essex. The underlying assumption is that automotive manufacturing jobs will migrate to the north. I am concerned, however, about the lack of analysis. My question is twofold, sir. Will you have an internal mechanism for tracking this sort of data to ensure that this provision does benefit auto workers in Canada? And the second part of it is, if the measures are not being properly implemented, is there a means for you to intervene to ensure compliance?
Thanks for that question. It's an excellent question. I'll tell you one piece of this is that the 40% applies to light cars. The 45% of this new labor value content applies to trucks. So there's two different conditions. There are mechanisms in the current language of the agreement that allow parties to whittle that down to as low as 25% labor value content. And it's conditioned on research and development work that can get pumped into the mix, that you can shave off some of those percentage obligations, as well as a very strange provision around powertrain operations and how many units you produce in a year. So it's not exactly a 40% clean figure. So with that, I think compliance will be a little bit easier to meet. But in terms of how this works out in practice, a lot of it will be conditioned on the uniform regulations that are still being written. We haven't seen a draft of those yet. And so we'll have to pay close attention to that, hoping to see those soon. But I guess to the question about monitoring, that is something that's been on our mind since day one, and not just on labor value content, but when you look at the new rules that apply to auto, I think they're the one sector that's seen the most significant transformation of the rules of origin. I might be wrong, but to me it seems more significant than others. And how these new very complex rules are going to be monitored is an open question. We have poked and prodded to try to get information on this, but we are told that these are proprietary bits of information that live and reside with Canadian Border Services and the exporters, and until they're willing to disclose that, we're a little bit in the dark. But absolutely, as this rolls out, this is something that's going to be a top of mind for us to poke around on.
Thank you. And one more question for you then, sir. Yesterday, Brian Kingston, representing the Business Council of Canada, in response to my question about implementation, indicated that one of the most complicated elements of this agreement is the rules of origin, particularly in the auto sector. He suggested that there is a lot of work to be done to ensure that the implementation phase does not create backlogs at the border. Do you have any concerns of your own about implementation, and are talks underway to ensure that the labor value content threshold will be properly tracked through the supply chain? Thank you.
Well, on the second part of your question, I think I've answered that. I mean, again, we don't. There's no tracking mechanism I'm aware of, and I think that as the regulations come out, these are questions that need to be asked as those are drafted. In terms of Mr. Kingston's comments, I do agree that there's a lot more to this new package of rules of origin. But if the question would be, is this something that is needed? I would say yes, given the extensive loopholes that existed in the original NAFTA deal. I guess, in some ways, seeing the trend that we were facing down with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for instance, where those rules of origin would have been further watered down, that even in a free trade zone that's giving tariff preferences to companies that are doing the trading, basically saying, in the TPP, half the car doesn't even have to come from the free trade zone, but we'll still give you the access, seemed a little bit ridiculous. And so the fact that we've moved the other way in the CUSMA, more stricter rules to try to maintain the integrity of what is a North American built car, so that if tariff-free preferences are given, that we can say that with a straight face, that is actually built in this continent. So for that reason, it probably is going to be complicated to work through, but I think a necessary step.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lewis. On to Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Geis. Thank you, Miss. Am I pronouncing it correctly? Maderso. Marston, sorry, and Mr. DiCarlo. My question is for Señor de la Cueva. Gracias por su apoyo y por su tiempo hoy. Voy a preguntar en inglés, con su permiso. So you discussed a lot the importance of some of the labor provisions that are found in the new NAFTA, and I wanted to touch on that in greater detail. In particular, as you know, there is a requirement now that almost half of automobile parts be made by workers earning at least $16 US per hour. And we heard from Mr. Angelo Di Caro just a few minutes ago on that point. But from your perspective in Mexico, does this level to some extent the playing field for auto workers in North America? And do you think that this is a good thing for both Canadian workers and Mexican workers?
Well, thank you for your question. I'll try to answer in my very bad English. I apologize for that. Well, we think in the auto workers independent unions in Mexico that this provision could not help a lot to us in Mexico. Why? Because less than 1% of the workers in Mexico work in the auto industry. The salaries are very far from $16 per hour. So any factory in Mexico will pay $16 per hour in a long time. So this provision will not promote the Mexican salaries increase. We think that, and even the labor chapter is not enough to promote an increase of the Mexican salaries. So to provide or to put the $16 per hour really don't means nothing in Mexico, because we are really far to get that salary. I mean, at least there are a strategy, regional strategy, para homologar, for homologation para arriba, for homologation to the top, the labor condition and the salaries, because it happens exactly the contrary in the NAFTA years. They homologize to down Mexican salaries and put pressure in US and Canada to low wages. So, well, to answer very concrete, I think this provision to $16 per hour will not could affect jobs in Mexico, but certainly will not promote Mexican salary increase. I think is to attack the social dumping. The social dumping. We need other provisions to really guarantee that the Mexican salaries could increase, including in the auto industry. So yes, this provision I think could affect jobs in Mexico and will not be pressure to increase the salaries. I don't know if I was clear.
Yes, perfectly clear. I'm not sure if you have any additional comments or from the Canadian perspective.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with Hector, and I think we've been consistent in understanding what that $16 provision will be. I also clarify too, so folks aren't left with a misunderstanding. Despite the fact that it signifies in the text of the agreement that this is a minimum wage of $16 US per hour, that is not what is being promoted in the new agreement. If you read the footnotes to that clause, somehow a minimum magically got turned into an average in the footnote. So we're talking about an average salary of $16 US per hour, which is about $21 Canadian. And they're in the uniform regulations, we'll find out exactly who's going to be included in that calculation. And so there's a lot of strange wiggle room being created in this, and we're paying very, very close attention to how that's going to shake out. But I think the intent of that, to be honest, was about creating a fail-safe on more component part work, moving from higher wage facilities in North America to the low wage ones. It was never intended to be about turning Mexican, transmission workers or powertrain workers making that amount of money. I think, as we said, the real reforms that are going to have an effect on collective bargaining and freedom of association will provide more of a lift to Mexican workers and independent unions to fight for those stronger wages.
I think there's also...
I'm sorry, Ms. Wright. Okay. Time is up. Thank you very much. On to Mr. Savard-Tremblay.
Oui. Oui, merci. Alors, comme le veut la...
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking you for being here. Thanks for coming all this way. I'm sure you have busy schedules and you're here to respond to our questions, so thank you. So you have presented on very different, disparate sectors, one from each other, and there was a lot of diversity in terms of the presentations today. Now, in the case of the online environment and the sugar, well, we don't hear as much from you in the context of this debate, so this is a fabulous opportunity. I'd like to ask Mr. Geis a question. The interpreters do a great job, but with a bit of lag, sometimes it's hard to keep up. But I'd just like some clarification. I know that there's been a number of scandals regarding data collection managed by a number of corporations and companies, but there seems to be a tendency, despite all this, towards a liberalisation of the digital environment. So I'd like your input on that. And when you look at the number of jobs in the big digital companies, Google and Facebook, we're struck by the fact that there is a very limited number of employees in these sectors, especially vis-à-vis the automobile sector. And yet, in the digital realm, well, we see that all corporations, companies, businesses are becoming digitized. So I'd like to hear about your concerns about data collection, the liberalization of trade. I just want to make sure that you've heard everything that I've said. But could you, I didn't hear entirely, but does this favor an opening of the door for data collection by major companies and corporations?
Sure. So thanks for those questions. I mean, it's quite clear that the digital trade chapter in particular is designed to liberalize digital trade further. And it won't come as much as a surprise that the template that is used in this agreement, which is similar to the template that we saw in the TPP and is similar to some other agreements, has its origins largely out of the United States. And so it's the U.S. that has pushed for particular provisions. What to me is perhaps most striking is that there are certain provisions that are optional in the sense that that all countries profess to say that they are trying to move in a certain direction, have a certain amount of privacy protection or consumer protection and the like. But where you see actual requirements, those are areas that I would argue there are some limitations in terms of our ability to establish full data sovereignty, for us to establish some of our own rules. And the perfect examples or the best examples are the ones that I provided in terms of data localization, requiring the information to be kept local, or restrictions on data transfers. Another interesting one, for example, might be on that ties into your questions around the large companies, around algorithms. We've seen a lot of emphasis lately about seeking greater information about the algorithms that are used by the Facebooks and Googles and other companies to determine how they are making some of their choices, let's say with respect to advertising and the like. There are restrictions in this agreement on our ability to compel disclosure of algorithms. Now, on many of these issues, there are good reasons for some of those provisions, but I think there is no question but that Canada's ability to regulate in the digital space will be circumscribed by this agreement. We've effectively agreed to certain provisions in this agreement that will take certain policy options off the table down the road.
Donc, autrement dit,
So, in other words, this could in fact open the door because the big corporations, these giants, can collect data for commercial and trade purposes because this agreement circumscribes their.
I mean, realistically, those organizations are already collecting, and we already have privacy rules. I think that, frankly, everybody recognizes that those privacy rules are out of date. And so that's where, in a sense, there's the potential for some friction. We've got, on the one hand, Navdeep Bains, the ICED minister, has made it clear that there is a desire to update Canada's privacy laws. I think there is a general sense that we are in desperate need for that. Part of the problem that we may face under this agreement is that some of the policy options that we would have in terms of trying to upgrade our privacy laws to make them more effective and relevant in the digital space may be limited by some of the things that we've agreed to within this agreement.
Parfait.
Excellent. Well, thank you. How much time do I have left? I see. Well, essentially, you're talking about limitations that will be as a result of the legislation, despite whatever politics is involved. Now, in your research, were this agreement to be ratified, have you thought about any solutions to limit the damage that you've alluded to?
Well, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think it depends a little bit on the issue. So, as I highlighted in my opening remarks, let's say on the issue of facing significant retaliatory tariffs on anything from steel to dairy to perhaps even sugar, who knows? I mean, in theory, the U.S. could target whatever they want to target as retaliation. To me, that sends a strong message about some of the cultural policy proposals that we've seen, particularly coming out of the Yale report. Frankly, I think they ought to be avoided. I think they're highly problematic and make us very vulnerable in that respect. On how do you address some of the potential privacy concerns that may arise as part of this, I think that there is some room to navigate. It's not that we have given up everything with respect to our ability to enact new privacy laws, but it is going to make it, I think, unquestionably more challenging were we to want to move towards something like, let's say, some restrictions on data transfers for highly sensitive information, or saying if it's health information, very sensitive health information, it's got to remain within Canada. We'd have a very hard time doing those kinds of things under this agreement.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Blakey.
Thank you very much. I just want to follow up on a couple of those questions, and in particular with respect to data localization. I mean, as part of the concern when we're talking about the United States too, they've got the Patriot Act, and I think one of the incentives for data localization requirements for Canada would be ensuring that Canadians' data isn't covered by the Patriot Act. I wonder if you want to speak to that a little bit on the level of individuals, but also commercial information that we may not want to have stored.
Sure. I mean, it raises an interesting point. I mean, for the people may recall that that particular issue arose nearly 20 years ago when the province of British Columbia was seeking to outsource some of its health information, and that health management information was going to go to the United States, and there was concern about the applicability of the USA Patriot Act. I would say that in the current environment, it speaks to a broader concern. And that is that the U.S., if we were to think of a spectrum of privacy safeguards around data, with the Europeans and the GDPR being viewed as having some of the strongest rules, the U.S. in many respects are often viewed as having the most lax rules. They have fairly weak rules, and in fact, this agreement builds in the ability for the U.S. to continue to have fairly weak rules without widespread privacy rules. Effectively, it's as little as tell people what you're going to do with their information, and as long as you abide by what you've told them, that's good enough. So it doesn't set a particularly high floor. So I think that there are concerns about the transfer of data into a jurisdiction, notably the United States, where some of those safeguards may not be as strong with respect to privacy. Questions about the ability for our own privacy commissioner to ensure that Canadian privacy rules will be applicable, and I think real doubts amongst many Canadians about whether or not their personal information will be appropriately safeguarded in that kind of environment.
Thank you very much. For Mr. DeCaro and Mr. De La Cueva, we've talked a little bit about how some of the new provisions may help, certify authentic bargaining units in Mexico. And I'm wondering if you can speak to a little bit about how that might work and what work needs to be done for our case on the Canadian end in order to make sure that the potential of those provisions is realized. There's been some discussion about, having an advisory committee for the government here composed of people such as yourself with experience in labor, but also from the business side who have had successful labor relations, and in order to provide the best advice on our end and sharing of best practices. So that's one example of what we might do in order to ensure that we're getting the most out of this agreement on that front. But I'm curious to hear what else we might do or how we might do that better.
So maybe I'll make a few comments and then Hector can fill in. I feel odd to be giving you this answer with Hector listening in here, but I don't know that anybody is holding their breath. I referred to in my remarks that the language of the text of the agreement is going to somehow be like the magic wand that's going to fix these problems. So there's going to be a lot of work ahead, and it's going to be very complicated. I think that one of the there's two very interesting features of the new agreement. One is the annex that sets out all these rules around freedom of association and freedom of collective bargaining. Essentially what the language of the annex says is that within a 4-year time period, facilities that have a collective agreement will have to undertake some sort of review and a democratic vote for their agreement, but also for their union executive. And as Hector referenced, in the case of these so-called protection contracts, those things just don't happen. Those things are not subject to democratic oversight. In a lot of cases that we've heard, there are workers in Mexico who are members of unions who can't get access to a collective agreement, and that's just the nature of the beast down there. So having that in place is one thing that has to be monitored. The other interesting thing about it is this rapid response mechanism. So where there is a potential violation, there is a very fast, expedited approach to making sure that those rights are being upheld, and they'll send in independent investigators to make sure that they're upheld. The question, I think that what we can do about it to move that along from Canada's point of view is that there is a process of determining what is a good faith complaint, because anybody could say anything about problems that are happening in Mexico and say, well, you need to investigate that, or that's a dispute. Not all of them will be. And so having a very clear, streamlined, and inclusive approach to getting this information, to generating evidence, to make very specific use of that rapid response mechanism is vital. And Canada is obligated under the terms of the revised agreement to do something like that. And so we're waiting for details on how that will work. So I think that's a good step. And maybe Hector will have more to add to this.
Yeah, thank you, Angelo. Well, as I said, in Mexico, these protection contracts means that some kind of mafia will have these contracts. I mean, in Mexico there are a lot of mafias, right? But there are not only the mafia on drug cartels, but there are also mafia in labor, in unions. So that means a protection contract. Mafia making business with the companies. So many Mexican workers work for Canadian and US companies to start. So if the Canadian and US companies refuse to make business with these mafias, it could help a lot. And if the governments encourage through the new treaty or with different tools that the companies don't make business with these mafias that don't represent the workers, that just have a secret contracts with the companies, could help a lot. I mean, to make the Mexican workers free. So
thank you very much, Mr. Director. I'm sorry to interrupt, but everybody's on a timeline. So maybe you can finish that thought with one of the other members as we go forward. On to Mr. Carey.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here. I want to start my questions with Dr. Geist, and want to thank everybody for being here, Dr. Geist. But I remember back in, I think it was 2007, you did a lot of work with us on industry committee for copyright and digital locks and all that stuff. And I think when you're looking at these issues that you're bringing forward, a lot of them kind of went under the radar with this agreement. And they're extremely important for Canada's future and our competitiveness. And just out of curiosity, because I believe you've studied around the world, you've studied in the US, the UK, all these different parts. Did the government use you as an expert when we were dealing with this chapter? Did they consult with you at all for this part of the agreement?
Well, the government opened up consultations for, I think, all Canadians, and I participated by providing a submission, and in fairness, have participated especially around the TPP on a couple of occasions, including a town hall with Minister Freeland, who was the international trade minister. But no, I wasn't working under an NDA or anything like that specifically with the government.
All right, because like I said, the things that you brought up, I don't really know where to start, like the copyright side of it, the privacy, data localization. But I did want to kind of delve into the copyright regulations, because you did say, because there is that lack of harmonization between the countries, and if we're looking at our future competitiveness, are you able to give us an opinion as someone who's an expert in the area? What kind of effects do you see this having on us here in Canada when it comes to our competitiveness with other jurisdictions like the U.S. as far as their businesses and content creators? Is there anything in this agreement that is going to encourage people, for example, to invest in Canada versus just, you know what, I don't want to deal with it, I'm just going to go to the States?
That's a really interesting question. And I think that, especially in the digital environment, this touches on a range of different issues, including the digital trade chapter and on copyright. I would say that on copyright, the work that we did back in 2007, leading up to the Copyright Modernization Act in 2012, as well as the copyright review that was conducted extensively by the Industry Committee last year and into that period, I think gives us a pretty good sense of where Canada stands. And I actually think Canada has been pretty innovative when it comes to some of our copyright rules. They meet international standards, but at the same time, many of them have been fairly forward-looking. But the issue around term extension, I think, is really an interesting one, because it's bipartisan in the sense that we had successive conservative governments and then later liberal governments who all rejected the notion of extending term of copyright. Basically, what the Canadian position was that we need to meet the minimum international standard that's established through something known as the Berne Convention. That is something that we do. The U.S. has long pressured us to extend the term of copyright. That extension in the United States is often referred to as the Mickey Mouse term extension, because Disney actively pressured for that term extension to keep Mickey out of the public domain. We took a look at that issue in Canada and said, we want to ensure that our artists are well compensated. We also want to ensure that consumers don't overpay. We want to ensure that there are appropriate levels of access in trying to strike that balance. And not extending the term of copyright was how we tried to do that. I can't put myself into the negotiating room to know why it was that after decades of saying no to term extension, we finally agreed to it in this agreement. But what I do know is that the best way to try to at least salvage a difficult and I think bad situation with respect to term extension is to take advantage of this transition period that the government did negotiate. And at least with respect to some kind of registration requirement, I think it offers up the prospect that for a small amount of works, for those works that there are rights holders that say we want to be competitive, we want to ensure that we've got as long a period of time for protection as possible, they'll make that registration, they'll get the extra 20 years. But for the enormous amount of Canadian heritage, for other works, those will enter into the public domain in accordance with the international standard. And so what we ought to be doing is, I think this committee ought to leave things alone in terms of where we are right now, recommend the registration process in keeping with what the Industry Committee and the Copyright Review said, and that we need to spend the next 30 months developing a registration process that, much like some of the other issues we dealt with many years ago, other countries may look to and say Canada provides a good example of how to strike that appropriate balance.
And you mentioned too, is that already?
5 minutes, Mr. Carey, on this round. Mr. Sarai, please.
Thank you for all of you and your presentations. I want to thank Mr. DeCaro. Unifor has a big presence in my riding, and family members and constituents are members, and you protect workers' rights, and it's has not gone unnoticed. When it comes to particular labor rights and not just the salary of $16 an hour in Mexico, but also the gender equality, also protection against abuse, threats, repeated threats, single threats. Does it not only affect and benefit the Mexican workers, but also uplift the labor industry in North America in general, and also at the same time protect Canadian workers that are in the auto sector? I think for my constituents to see that it's not only about improving the rights of workers in Mexico, but also the rights of workers in Canada when they have parity or at least close to parity in worker rights in North America on the same products that are being processed.
I guess I wouldn't go so far as to talk about parity of the certain auto rights, but on the other pieces of it, you're absolutely right. The agreement, we've been talking a lot about the auto rules as they relate to labor. Talking a little bit about the Mexican annex that was negotiated to deal with the issues that Hector had raised on protection contracts and all that. But the chapter itself is in a lot of areas is fundamentally different than what we've had in the previous NAFTA. It's a sea change in terms of what was in the original NAFTA, covering stronger obligations for the parties. There's a wider reaching obligations for the parties. Those obligations not only refer to core standards like collective bargaining, freedom of association, but freedom of association also has a connection to the right to strike, which is, again, a remarkable inclusion into this deal that appears as a clarifying footnote. But as you say, there's provisions on gender equality, there's provisions on worker violence, there's provisions for the first time on migrant workers moving cross borders. And so I think what you're seeing is an attempt to hear a lot of the concerns that have been raised over the past 30 years on NAFTA's failings and try to address those in kind. Now, do I think it could have gone much further? I think so. I think there's areas, but like anything, we can do that. But when you look at it in isolation and you look at the labor chapter as it stands now with its connection to dispute settlement, which we've never had before, fixing a lot of the terms, because some of the labor provisions are carbon copies of the Trans-Pacific Partnership labor terms. They've proven to be effectively useless through dispute settlement rulings that have happened. This deal corrects that. It corrects about 75% of that. And so much of this is better than what we had that I think, it certainly is going to bring us down a different path going forward.
Thank you, Mr. DeCaro. Mr. Geist, you gave a good analysis in the sense of saying we should ratify this, but we should work on some of the privacy and other provisions in the next 30 months to correct it. What do you say are the fundamental key provisions that need to be protected for Canadians in this digital age, and what are the foremost ones that need to be done?
Okay, sure. Well, let me just clarify. I think with respect to the issue of copyright term extension, that's where there is this 30-month phase-in period or transition period. And on that issue, I think that we ought to follow the recommendations that we saw from the copyright review. In terms of moving ahead with ratifying and solving this, I mean, candidly, the challenge is I don't know enough about the sugar industry or about labor practices or about the myriad of other issues. No, just to highlight how difficult it becomes when what you're effectively being asked to do is, do I trade my privacy for greater access of beet sugar or better labor standards? I don't know. I mean, I know what I know around privacy. And I think one of the challenges we face in the current trading environment, and it is particularly pronounced in this deal, is that there are many issues that do not come out, are not as obvious right up front, in part because we're not required to make any changes. Canada, like many countries, will often negotiate by saying our starting point is, as long as we don't have to change our existing laws, we're okay. The problem here is that we have locked ourselves in on a number of different issues, and it includes on copyright, includes on privacy, as well as some of the other issues that I've highlighted. And I do have real concerns that as we get into some of those issues, and they're taking up a lot of bandwidth right now for a lot of people, we may find ourselves having essentially given away some of the potential policy solutions because we're restricted now by virtue of this agreement. And it's not obvious to me that there's a solution in that regard.
Thank you very much. Yes, on to Mr. Cram.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for everyone joining us today. I have some questions for Mr. Geist with respect to the cultural exemption. Could you elaborate a little bit on what exactly changed in the new NAFTA compared to the old NAFTA with respect to the cultural exemption, in particular the retaliatory measures that are now available to the U.S.?
Yeah. In fact, not a lot has changed. We added a couple of things. There were a couple of things that were added within this provision where we talked about broadcasting and some other issues. But, I raised this to emphasize that this notion that we've taken culture off the table, and that's a big win, I think really doesn't tell the whole story of what it means to regulate in the current cultural environment. And that, in fact, and this may be unavoidable, but if we move forward with different kinds of proposals or see the kinds of proposals, let's say, that we saw from the Yale report, that do envision reforms within Canada's digital sector, within Canada's cultural sector, that quite clearly run afoul of the kinds of things that we've now agreed to within this new NAFTA. What we are doing is, I think, potentially setting ourselves up for the U.S. to say, if you want to do this, we've given you the right to do it, or you've negotiated the right to have that policy flexibility, but it's not free. In order for you to be able to take advantage of that, we are entitled to be able to levy measures of equivalent commercial effect, and we're free to pick and choose on whatever industry we want to have that kind of effect. So, for example, if you're talking about new kinds of levies on large internet companies, which is one of the proposals in the Yale report, potentially talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that they will have to pay into that system. If the rules that we have are seen to violate the new NAFTA, what that means is that the U.S. will be entitled to levy against whatever they want to target in Canada, measures of equivalent commercial effect. There is potentially a huge cost involved.
And could you describe some of the current cultural programs or policies that Canada has in place now that could be put at risk for some of these retaliatory tariffs or retaliatory measures from the U.S.?
Sure. So just to use, I guess, the Yale report to give you a couple of examples. One is this notion that the Yale report recommends having just about almost any website, certainly the large services like the Netflixes of the world, but it potentially captures many others, paying in either through levies or other sorts of fees. The problem with that system is that we at the same time have systems in place that are only available to Canadian businesses. So we say we're going to make it like for like. Canadian businesses pay into this. Now foreign businesses will have to pay into this. The problem is the only beneficiaries in some instances are the Canadian businesses. That's not like for like. That may well violate some of the services provisions that we have within NAFTA, and that may lead to retaliatory measures. We've also got, for example, discoverability requirements, the CRTC determining potentially what sites news aggregators have to link to. That may violate some of the rules that we have right now in terms of free flow of information. There's a cost there. The U.S. might be entitled to retaliate.
And just to be clear, you said that these retaliatory measures would not be limited to the culture sector. Was that?
That's exactly right. It's measures of equivalent effect. It does not specify that it's got to be in the cultural sector. We can expect the United States to target sectors where they think it's going to have the most impact in an effort to try to dissuade Canada from violating some of the provisions in the agreement by virtue of relying on the exemption.
So, for example, down the road, if there were some new online streaming service that were all Canadian, and the U.S. felt that that was crowding them out of the Canadian market to the tune of $100 million a year, let's say, that means the Americans could turn around and slap $100 million on maple syrup exports or anything else going across the border the other way?
No, I'm not sure that having an all-Canadian service would be a violation. Although if you had a situation where Canadian government decided we want to have an all-Canadian service, we're going to fully fund it and require others to pay into it, then yes, foreign services might say that's an unfair advantage to a Canadian-based service. Here's the cost or the commercial effect, and the U.S. would be entitled to levy measures of equivalent commercial effect, and they could target whatever sector they like.
Hey, thank you very much. Sorry, Mr. Krem. On to Mr. Dhaliwal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Earlier, Mr. Sabat Tremblay mentioned the great work that our translators do when we speak here, particularly in accent like myself. Madam Chair, I would like to thank all the support staff that is working with these extended hours, including our, on both sides as well, and, because it's great work. My question is going to go to Madam Marsden from the Canadian Sugar Institute, because I wanted to give you an opportunity to say a few things. And CUSMA, you said that will preserve the existing sugar and sugar-containing product provisions between Canada and the U.S. and the Mexico, and will add new access to the U.S. For sugar and the sugar-containing products. Could you tell me what were you hoping that would be achieved through this agreement that is not here particularly?
Thank you. Well, the volume gains are much lower than we had hoped for. The U.S. is an 11 million ton sugar market, so we got another 10,000 tons of sugar and sugar-containing products. It's exceedingly small, so the volume gains were very small. The other, the devil's in the details when it comes to the sugar market, as in other protected markets. So we wanted to see a change to the current rules around the quota access that we have for sugar-containing products, because we can't utilize that quota. The U.S. restricts our exports to retail-ready products. We can't ship to food service. We can't ship to institutions, restaurants, bakeries. So there were no changes there. And other issues around rules of origin in certain products and so on.
Thank you. Next question to Junifor. Mr. Daicaro, your president has said, I'm going to quote, NAFTA has been a train wreck of trade deal for last 25 years, causing great harm to Canada's manufacturing industries and the rights of the workers. The new CUSMA, while far from perfect, provides a roadmap to implement necessary changes in trade policy to benefit workers. The improvements announced in this agreement are helpful to boost in achieving those objectives. Does this agreement allow for job security in the industry, and how does this create certainty, especially when it comes to Canadian workers?
Well, I'd say that the fact that this deal is going to get done is probably as much certainty as people have had in the last 3 years of this kind of roller coaster. So in a way, that becomes a good thing. I know a lot of different and big investment decisions have been on pause, people waiting to find out what these final rules are going to look like. So I think just by virtue of having the kind of this tumultuous period come to a close is a good thing. I think Jerry, I'm not going to speak for Jerry, but I think some of the outcomes of the last number of months, the eventual elimination of the steel and aluminum tariffs have been a big weight lifted off that industry, and so it's not entirely connected to the deal that's in front of us in Bill C4, but it's a big thing for our members in those metal sectors. So that was very helpful. And then as we talk about the auto industry, which I've heard many commentators talk about, the U.S. FTA with Canada originally in 1988 and then spilling into the NAFTA has largely been about autos. I think that's maybe a little bit myopic for us to think that way, but it's a big component. And I think what we've seen come out of the auto chapter, has been a real change in what we've seen with respect to the auto industry in previous trade agreements, where, as Mr. Geist was saying, it's always complicated when you're trading things off that you don't fully understand. But I'll tell you, from the position of auto workers, and folks in those communities will know, it feels like they've been the ones who have been the sacrificial lambs that have been put out there for other gains in other sectors. And so this is the first time it seems that the intent was to try to create greater certainty for them. And so for that, I think we've done pretty well. There are still aspects of it, I think, that could be tightened up. But at this point, just having this thing in place and hoping that now investments will start to kind of smooth out and trickle in is a good thing.
Thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay, 2 minutes.
En 2 minutes, on va y aller aussi sur...
In 2 minutes, let me go back to the rules of origin. For Mr. Angelo Di Caro, and for the gentleman whose name has escaped me, I'm awfully sorry. Yes, De La Cueva, if he still hears us. Is it correct to say that in this age of climate change, the interest and the trend in the automobile sector is for lighter parts, lighter than they were in the past?
Donc, puis au niveau des règles...
So back to the rules of origin. Given that this has been much discussed, it was a central issue in the debate. As we know, steel and aluminum aren't getting the same treatment. So do you see any consequences to the differences in the way that steel and aluminum is being handled, given that Mexico, for example, is not an aluminum producer and must import its supply?
The consequences are not clear about what the disparity between the steel and aluminum provisions are in the NAFTA. One of the things that's important to put in perspective, although I'm not going to diminish it, but it's the aluminum industry, for instance, is a very, very big industry in Canada, especially in BC and in Quebec. What we're talking about in the NAFTA are changes that apply to original equipment manufacturers purchasing steel and aluminum and where that comes from. Only for the purposes of that, so only auto. That's all we're talking about. And so, yes, it's unfortunate that there's disparity. And this is creating a little bit of insecurity among folks. The bigger picture that we see is that there's some just broad-based insecurity in the aluminum sector overall. We're seeing growth in export production and overcapacity from places like China. We're seeing Russian imports, Icelandic imports, imports coming from all over the world. That's putting greater pressure on Canadian producers and where the supplies are coming from. So when
Thank you very much, Mr. Di Caro.
I'm sorry. Yep.
Mr. Blakey, you have 2 minutes.
We'll talk after.
Thank you very much. Mr. Geist, I just wanted to ask, one of the philosophical differences, frankly, that the NDP has with free trade agreements is that they don't enshrine a precautionary principle at all. And they do make it hard to regulate down the road for the things that you couldn't have accounted for when you signed the deal, or that some industry experts might have been able to, but to the layperson and many people in government and trade negotiators even just wouldn't be aware of. Now, in the case of something like the auto sector, you can get to a point, and this certainly seems to have happened more than at any other time, where you have companies and a union representing workers, and those are the interests. There's a consumer interest too, but who other than the big data companies are in the room or could have been in the room to represent the interests of Canadians and their information? I think that seems to me to be one of the deficiencies here, that it is very one-sided when you're talking about negotiating these provisions, because Facebook and Google are there. Who would be the counterpoint that might have been in the negotiating room?
I'm not sure that there was a counterpoint on the digital trade chapter in particular. I think that one gets the sense that these provisions were familiar to negotiators because they are similar to what we agreed to in the TPP. And so because there was some familiarity with it, there was a sense that, okay, we've already agreed to these once. What's the big deal? I think the reality is, though, that there are some provisions in this agreement that go further than even that we agreed to in the TPP, and that the extent to which we may have agreed to it a couple of years earlier in a different agreement, some of those issues have become even more salient. A good example is the internet platform liability issue. Seems to me that that's there less because some of the large platforms are interested in having Canada create safe harbors for these large companies, and they were more interested in ensuring that these were locked down in the U.S. environment because the U.S. will be subject to those same provisions. The problem that we face is that while we were negotiating that issue really took off as a place where there's much policy debate taking place. Literally, the Justice Department of the United States is holding a hearing today on this same issue. And Speaker of the House Pelosi tried to remove this provision at the very last minute, but it was too late. As I say, I think there's good arguments on both sides about changing some of those rules. I fear that we have now locked ourselves into a provision and given ourselves less flexibility on an issue that just about everybody recognizes is really, really important when we start talking about where responsibility lies in the online environment.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our witnesses for that excellent information. We will suspend in order to change our panel of witnesses. calling the meeting back to order. If the members could,
Please don't start with Mr. Volpe.
yes, make their way back to the table. We appreciate it. Pursuant to order of reference of Thursday, February 6, 2020, we are doing a study of Bill C-4, an act to implement the agreement between Canada, the United States of America, and the United Mexican States. And with us on this panel for the next 2 hours is the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, President Flavio Volpe, the Association of Home Appliance Manufacturers Canada, Megan Hatch, Director, Government Relations, and Kevin Guerrari, Manager, Policy and Data Analysis. From HTC Systems, Stephen Beasley, Vice President, IPEX Group of Companies, Viso Sobat, and Teamsters Canada, Phil Benson and Christopher Monette, Director of Public Affairs. Thank you all very much for making the time to be here today. Mr. Volpe, we'll start with you with your comments, please.
Sure, I think that one of your staff took my speech because they were going to make copies for everybody, but I'll do it extemporaneously as I always do here.
Mr. Volpe, hold on one second
All right.
here.
You're the boss.
We're copying your notes for the translator, so we're going to hold down for a few minutes, Mr. Volpe, and we will start. How about if we start with Ms. Hatch?
Good afternoon. AHAM represents manufacturers of major portable and floor care appliances in Canada and the United States. Our membership includes over 150 companies. The industry supports 40,000 jobs in Canada, including manufacturing, sales, distribution, and retail. In Canada, the economic impact of the appliance industry is close to $6 billion annually. AHAM supports the rapid adoption of Bill C-4 and CUSMA. Canada is a net importer of home appliances, with the U.S. and Mexico being the predominant trading partners. Manufacturers design appliances for a single North American market. This larger market increases consumer choice, drives down costs, and maximizes economies of scale. We support Chapter 11 and Chapter 28 of the agreement that aims to reduce technical barriers to trade and increase regulatory alignment. We also support Annex 12D that is specific to our industry and calls for energy performance standards and test procedures to be harmonized. It also encourages the use of voluntary programs such as Energy Star, noting that they contribute to improving energy efficiency for a range of products. This is why we'd like to raise an issue that is of great concern to our members both in Canada and the United States. The Liberal Party has put forward a commitment to make Energy Star certification mandatory for all home appliances by 2022. If all home appliances are required to be Energy Star, almost half of what's available in the market today will vanish, and in the future it could rise to 75%. Although implementation has not started, it has created great uncertainty in the market for both manufacturers and retailers. If the government moves forward with making Energy Star mandatory, Canada will be going against the intent of CUSMA. But more importantly, Canadians will experience a significant reduction in products that are available on the market. In fact, a staggering 41% of what is currently sold in Canada today will no longer meet these requirements. Because of the sharply limited model selection, it is likely that low-income Canadians will end up paying more for entry-level models. A price rise could be made worse by the greater cost of manufacturing such products, since more efficient components may be costlier and in some cases more fundamental construction changes are needed. And unfortunately, in certain cases, minor energy savings would be achieved. This is because overall, today's home appliances are very energy efficient, and the cost to further improve efficiency can be significant depending on maturity of the existing technology. Both NRCan and the U.S. Department of Energy set mandatory minimum energy efficiency standards that all appliances must meet, and these have become more strict over time. Home appliances have undergone several standards changes. Some products are nearing maximum efficiency under available technology, and in some cases, the basic laws of thermodynamics. Energy Star is a voluntary program. The purpose is to make it easy for consumers to identify higher energy efficiency products. It is intended to highlight the top 25 to 30% or best in class of energy efficiency. This competition motivates manufacturers to find new innovation. Manufacturers, in turn, make significant investments to qualify for the program. If the Canadian market is limited to Energy Star products, this competition ends and the mark loses meaning. If the government mandates that everything be Energy Star, then it renders the brand meaningless. Article 12D5 of CUSMA clearly states its support for voluntary programs such as Energy Star to promote energy efficiency. This is in direct contrast to the government's proposal to make the Energy Star program mandatory. Another rather significant issue with the Liberal commitment is that the Energy Star brand is not owned by the Canadian government. The Energy Star brand is owned and trademarked by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The U.S. government administers the program and sets the levels that manufacturers must meet in order to qualify for the designation. The Energy Star brand is highly praised by both NRCan and industry alike. The brand is recognized by 85% of the public, and the logo is used around the world. We want it to continue. The Energy Star commitment is also inconsistent to the Liberal approach to energy efficiency over the last 4 years. In Canada, the federal, provincial, and territorial governments all have important roles to play in setting energy efficiency standards. In 2016, the FPT governments developed a framework encouraging market transformation through collaboration on energy efficiency standards. The framework states, and I quote, "When federal, provincial, and territorial governments are not coordinated, it may have to test an identical product more than once to sell it across Canada. This can lead to unnecessary costs, reduce the product choices available in the market, and create barriers to internal trade between provinces. Making Energy Star levels mandatory is also in stark contrast to the government's approach to energy efficiency harmonization with the United States through the work of the Regulatory Cooperation Council. In 2018, Canada and the United States signed a Memorandum of Understanding to formalize the RCC and reaffirm the importance of regulatory cooperation. At the time, the President of the Treasury Board noted that aligning energy efficiency standards through the work of the RCC was the best way forward because it would save Canadians about $1.8 billion in energy costs by 2030. This is exactly why CUSMA commits to regulatory harmonization and supports voluntary programs like Energy Star. Canada has historically been slow to adopt the stricter energy efficiency standards introduced in the United States. Since 2016, under this government, the two countries have made significant strides towards harmonization and alignment through the work of the Regulatory Cooperation Council. Canada is now finally aligned with the United States. This process took over 10 years. It would be shame to throw it all away. Regulatory alignment is critical to avoid unnecessary double testings, barriers to trade, and it maximizes consumer product choice. Instead of making Energy Star mandatory, the government should continue to adopt the regulatory framework that can more quickly update its standards. Bill C-4 and CUSMA creates a structure for this harmonization to thrive. AHEM has been a strong advocate for advancements in energy efficiency standards, but making Energy Star mandatory will have negative consequences for middle-class Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hatch. Okay, on to Mr. Beasley.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Chair. I want to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to appear and give testimony to this committee, both on behalf of myself and Regina's HTC Extraction Systems. They are a superlative carbon capture company that I'll tell you more about in just a second. So it's been my previous honor to testify to the Standing Committee on the Environment regarding Canada's greenhouse gas strategies, and on behalf of the Government of Canada to the U.S. Department of Energy on developing resource energy conservation technologies. I'm considered an expert in a field of science referred to as gas treating. I'm a proud second-generation oilman. I've dedicated my career towards creating superb environmental technologies that have been installed in 5 of the world's continents. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm absolutely delighted that our Canadian political leaders have expended significant effort to bring this massive potential of continued free trade between Canada and our friends in the United States and Mexico. With this initiative, we're truly blessed. But folks, we can never forget that we live next door to the largest, most competitive economy on the planet. Their size is 10 times ours, and their economy exceeds that by an order of magnitude. So when it comes down to it, we also have to be very mindful of our Mexican friends. As we heard earlier in the previous testimony, they have a skilled workforce and are prepared to work for half of what our wages are. Now, if we, the Canadian people, are to truly gain from this free trade relationship, we must think and we must act strategically. We must reflect on the consideration of public policy and taxation strategies that perhaps our trading partners have no intention of adopting, and if we do consider we must consider its impact in our ability to compete. Our economy, our municipalities, our businesses must be competitive in order to fully benefit from this free trade relationship, and we must create foundations so that we're able to effectively compete. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to talk about the elephant in the room, which of course is Canada's global warming concerns and our nation's strategies and their potential impact to this competitiveness. We must find an effective balance, and indeed, I know we can. Prime Minister Trudeau and Deputy Minister Chrystia Freeland have recently publicly stated that even if we eliminated all sources of carbon from coast to coast in this country, we will not move the dial internationally. I believe they're both absolutely right. I believe that the best Canada can do is to develop and fully perfect technologies which the rest of the world can confidently adopt. Now, Canada has provided this leadership before, and it was a glorious success in both our environmental and our trade relationships with the Americans. There's some gray hair in this room, and there's some not so gray hair, but some of us will remember yet another existential threat to our well-being and the environment called the threat of acid rain. In the 1970s, this environmental threat was truly horrific, and the threat was immediate. In essence, pollution from industrial factories was causing acidified rain, which was rapidly killing North America's lakes and water bodies. At that time, the Canadian government, together with the United States, created public policy through clean air legislation which mandated industry fix this problem. Ladies and gentlemen, and they did. They turned this environmental threat into a technical and entrepreneurial success story. Our free trade agreement must consider this. Most importantly, this was accomplished rapidly and without punitive, harmful policies which harmed our society's competitiveness. The analogy then is the exact analogy today in terms of solving these problems, and at the end of the day, as a society, I know we can do it. Now, bear with me. On February 12th, there was a press release which announced that the United States had led the world in carbon dioxide reduction, while at the same time becoming the world's leading hydrocarbon-producing nation. They accomplished this environmental miracle without punitive taxation. We must consider similar strategies. If Canada focused its efforts on the creation of public policy which unlocked the technical and entrepreneurial capacity of our nation, there is nothing that we could not accomplish. We could cure cancer. We cured polio. We could cure Alzheimer's, and we can most certainly create superlative environmental technologies which solves the environmental challenges without harming our economy, and as a result, we can be competitive in this North American Free Trade Agreement which we're considering today. Now, I believe also that we cannot solve these problems at the household level. In the same manner that acid rain was solved, we must look at this from an industrial perspective, and we must engage our free trade partners in the pursuit. And indeed, ladies and gentlemen, we can profit from this under free trade, and we can lead the world in environmental technologies. As one example of many, on December 2nd, 2017, the Saskatchewan government signed accord with the governors of Montana, Wyoming, North and South Dakota for the further development of its CCS EOR initiative. This initiative has removed 3 million tons of carbon dioxide, which is the equivalent of removing 750,000 automobiles off the road. President Trump referenced this in his 2018 State of the Union address. Now, with respect to free trade and our environmental commitments, it was announced on November 8th of 2019 that the United States shale oil production has peaked. That production miracle, which allowed them to become the world's largest crude oil producer, they are now in decline. What that means is that Canada's oil and gas is about to become strategic to the United States again, and that will happen sooner rather than later. Our oil and gas resources represent one of the greatest sources of wealth our country has ever been blessed with, and we must embrace this for the benefit of all Canadians. Now, we understand that there's some in societies that feel that somehow this is directly opposed to our environmental commitments. Ladies and gentlemen, nothing could be further from the truth. We've showed leadership before, and we can do it again, and we should do it again. Now, I've previously worked with SAS Power on the CCS EOR project, and I'm currently working with Regina's HTC Technologies, and our team are some of the most dedicated individuals you'll ever meet. We are creating superlative technologies which capture CO2 at an industrial level. We've been selected by the Alberta government in its quest for, quote, the world's best carbon capture technology, and we're proud to be part of the team which is vying for the Environmental X Prize. Now, free trade between Canada, the United States, and Mexico truly represents a glorious opportunity for all regions of Canada, but for this to truly work for all of us, we must think and we must act strategically. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very, very much. I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. We must, while we're looking at North American free trade, we must have a commitment to fully ratifying Section 121 of the Canadian Constitution, which, of course, is the dedication to interprovincial free trade. This is a major strategic problem for Canada, which must be fixed. I would say this should be the first priority rather than a free trade deal with the United States and Mexico. We got to get our own house in order so we can compete in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for your time.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Beasley. Now we'll go back over to Mr. Volpe.
Thank you. Pleasure to be back here, Madam Chair and members. Where are we and how did we get here? We're discussing the attributes of the new NAFTA, having negotiated at an unprecedented speed and with a heretofore unseen bellicose and belligerent trading partner. This partner, our celebrated best friend, the United States, was bent on disrupting the global trading order with little regard for precedent or consequence. It's important to understand context. We're not debating an academic study written into a vacuum, here to be picked apart by subject matter experts. We're here to discuss what happened in the real world from 2015 to 2019 to get us to where we are today. Members of this committee will be among the only ones tasked with voting to ratify the new agreement or not. There is no vehicle for renegotiation, adjustment, or request for discussions with two other trading partners. You're faced with an up or down vote. Through no fault of your own or the government that negotiated it. It is what it is, and there are no surprises in it. The text of the agreement signed in October 2018 has been available online since November 2018. The text of the revisions negotiated between parties as a condition of U.S. congressional support was signed in November 2019 and available online since December 2019. From August 2017 through September 2018, parties met in Washington, Ottawa, Montreal, and Mexico City repeatedly, and I was present at every single round, including the December 2017 This Isn't Really a Round round. I met with officials before, during, and after every single round, and I did over 600 on-the-record media hits on what we were looking for, what we needed to see. No surprises. So for the third time in the lifespan of these negotiations, I'm here again at committee to share candid thoughts and positions that probably every one of you know I hold. In June of 2015, at the infamous Trump Tower escalator speech where he announced his candidacy for Republican nominee for President of the United States, Donald Trump said this about the Ford Motor Company investment in Mexico. Quote, every car and every truck and every part manufactured that comes across the border, we're going to charge you a 35% tax. And that tax is going to be paid simultaneously with the transaction, and that's it. We were in the middle of exhausting TPP negotiations that resulted in a flawed document in October later that year. In a New York Times piece that described the TPP as, quote, subject to future political battles in the United States and elsewhere, I was quoted as saying, quote, anybody who's championing gains or who is forecasting losses is way ahead of themselves. In February 2016, Donald Trump had declared that if he'd win, he would extract the U.S. from it, and its status as the de facto NAFTA update would be put into question. In July of 2016, when challenged that his tariff plans would not pass WTO muster and his TPP withdrawal threat would be costly, candidate Trump said, quote, then we're going to renegotiate or we're going to pull out. Lumping in NAFTA, he said, quote, these trade deals are a disaster. You know, the World Trade Organization is a disaster. We were warned in plain sight what a President Trump would do and mean for our trading relationship. Still, no one thought he'd win at that point and that he was at best a ill-informed, soon-to-be former candidate. I took his election threat seriously. In September 2016, I led a delegation of Canadian automotive suppliers to Capitol Hill in Washington to speak to senior senators and staffers about the implications of a Trumpian reset on trade. I met with USTR on its threat to pull out of TPP, which I had hoped for because it reduced the regional value content on automotive suppliers to as low as 35% from NAFTA 60%. At an event at the prestigious Press Club on September 28, 2016, a month before the election, I delivered an address that described Canada as the, quote, smallest of the three NAFTA partners, and that it needed to, quote, clearly target large new advanced manufacturing commitments from foreign automakers to keep pace with Mexican and U.S. growth. All the tariff threats and angst were clearly on the minds of the industry and the central focus of our activity pre-election that year. In September 2016 automotive news piece on the tariff threat, I said that Canada and other countries look to the U.S. to set an example, and that recklessness on the part of the U.S. would encourage other countries to disregard world trade rules. My quote conceded that there was some merit to the Trumpian complaints, but cautioned that a U.S. over-response would even be more harmful. Quote, some of the rest of the world does cheat on these obligations, but the solution isn't for the global trading leader to drop its standards in response. It's a tough spot to be in, but you're there for a reason. It's like Superman getting into a bar fight. Why? Canada, its largest trading partner, the United States, and Mexico have agreed to the CUSMA to replace the existing NAFTA. This is the first trade deal between major auto-producing nations since the original NAFTA that sees the regional value content for automotive production go up in the region. A higher RVC in vehicles means that if an automaker wants to sell to a consumer in the three countries, it needs to source more of its content in those three countries. Since the original NAFTA moved RVC on vehicles up from the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement from 50% to 62.5%, we have seen a succession of trade deals where Canadian governments have progressively negotiated Canadian automotive suppliers' considerations downwards. Canada-Korea is 55%. CETA RVC is 50%, CPTPP is 45%. In the CUSMA, the vehicle RVC level rises from 62.5% to 75%, a 20% notional increase. That means more local activity and jobs. To get to the NAFTA RVC, an automaker has to track local content in 29 parts categories. To be eligible, the RVC of those automotive parts must only be 60%. The CUSMA expands the list of categories almost double and raises the automotive parts RVC as high as 75%, an increase in some cases of 25% notionally through the supply chain. The North American automotive market is approximately 21 million units annually and is the most sought-after consumer market in the automotive world. Raising the thresholds to access it benefits companies that have invested in plants and in people within the CUSMA. While the cost of an automobile may increase marginally if manufacturers are required to source supplies from within the NAFTA region rather than from the cheapest global sources, the benefit will be more investment in Ontario, Quebec, BC, and in many U.S. and Mexican states, and less in the places that sell to us but do not buy from us, like the members of the CPTPP, CETA, and Canada-Korea. In automotive, the CUSMA addresses the protectionist needs of the U.S. administration but wraps in its purview Canada and Mexico as primary partners. Side agreements for exemptions on tariff threats were a major challenge, but Canada and Mexico achieved an insurance policy on this that's worth noting. As detractors here at home decried the side agreements, I told The Economist magazine that, quote, normally trade agreements are self-reinforcing, but this one is being held together by threats. This is the context that we are working in, not some respectful bargaining between partners with equal leverage. All vehicles in the CUSMA will now need to meet a minimum threshold of 40% being made by workers making at least $16 an hour. Canada will benefit. Mexico may suffer. This provision was created during the final course of the negotiations and bilateral U.S. and Mexican discussions that caused a stir with Canadian commentators who said Canada has no role in those talks. Meeting frequently with U.S. and Mexican negotiators during that period, I didn't share that opinion. I told a Wall Street Journal front page report that the labor value content proposal, quote, disproportionately affects Mexico, and that, quote, we were advising Canada not to comment or take a position until the Mexicans did. And that's what Canada's negotiators did. The U.S. is committed to raising the cost of importing automotive goods from overseas. In June 2019, I told this committee that the U.S. was using the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariff threat to bully its partners and intended to use the WTO process to raise the 2.5% most favored nation tariff dramatically. On February 12th of this year, Bloomberg reported that from Washington, that the Trump administration is mulling a plan to increase those long-standing tariff rates at WTO. This is a move that is aimed at rewriting its relationships with major trading partners. Importantly, Canada negotiated Section 232 exemptions from the U.S. at production levels that materially outpace export growth models to the U.S. over the next 5 to 10 years. Specifically, Canada will be permitted to ship 2.6 million vehicles annually and $32 billion in automotive parts to the United States tariff-free, up 40% from today. Ending the fraught negotiation process with a deal that increases investment and more competitive market access for Canada is extraordinary. Unlike the Houston Astros hitters, nobody hit the garbage bins for us. We had to react to pitches on skill with no warning, and we won. We enjoyed unprecedented access to the Canadian negotiating team. In addition to this, I sought and received in-person access to the White House, USTR, the Mexican president, and his negotiating team. I will write a book one day chronicling the behind-the-scenes actions. Chapter 1 may be the USTR reaction to my November 2017 Canadian Press headline lampooning their silly materials tracing proposals with, "Do we need to know where the dinosaurs died?" Today, I want to give full credit for our success on CUSMA to Chrystia Freeland, Steve Rahul, and their team of tireless officials that consulted constantly with the Canadian automotive industry all over the continent. They deserve specific credit. Martin Thornell, Karen LaHaye, Andre Marinescu, Aaron Fowler, all of Team Canada and the government of Canada. It was a nonpartisan, public-private effort, and it was amazing, and I was proud to be a footnote in this history's chapter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Volpe. On to Mr. Civil.
Thank you. My name is Veso Sobat, and I'm an engineer with IPEX. We manufacture plastic pipe for construction. If you take a look under your sink tonight when you go home, late at night tonight, my goodness, you guys have stamina. You will see black pipe under there. That's probably our stuff. Or you'll see gray pipe at the side of your house. That's electrical pipe that we make. Or blue pipe out in the streets, and that's water main pipe that we make. Or green pipe, which is sewer pipe. We were founded in 1949 in Toronto. Our founders escaped Estonia and got to Toronto and started making hula hoops at night and selling them during the day. And within 3 years, they made their first $1 million. And our founders said, look, you know, this hula hoop thing, it might be a fad. We better diversify. And they straightened out the hula hoop, and that's how we got into the pipe business. Today, we've made enough pipe to go around the world about 200 times. Of course, very important to us is the U.S. trade relationship. We have 15 plants in Canada, 5 in Ontario. We have now 10 plants in the United States. In 2009, when President Obama signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that called for Buy America, we were shut out of the U.S. market for probably about 12 months. It was devastating to us. We lost long-standing customers. We've never been able to regain them. And we also lost some logistical chains that we had access to. It took about 12 months for Canada to negotiate a Canadian exemption to Buy America. Here's my bottom line recommendation to the group. Please pass USMCA as soon as possible, or CUSMA as we call it, locking in the gains that we have. But please understand that there are no protections in CUSMA for America to go do Buy America again or Buy American again. They can cut us off tomorrow. We won't be able to ship into the United States tomorrow. You might say, well, you have 10 plants in the States. It should be okay. But the truth is, a lot of those plants have specialties. So we ship product amongst ourselves. Product that's made in Chicago or in Michigan comes back to Toronto for certain products. And products that are made in North Carolina come back to Toronto and vice versa. So although we have some flexibility, we don't have huge flexibility. So my bottom line there too is, Madam Chair, if your folks can consider some sort of a fund just in case America cuts us off again, some sort of a fund that could help Canadian manufacturers if they're injured because America decides to implement Buy America again. That would be wonderful. Sort of like how you did for steel and aluminum. That was very, very effective, appropriate, and gave a little bit more security to Canadian industry. One more thing, if I could, there is a clause in the new NAFTA, clause 3211, that talks about Mexico's exemption to certain Buy America issues. We don't know exactly how this is all going to play out. It would be wise for us to take a close look at Clause 3211 and check and see whether Mexico has a little bit of an advantage on us or not. If the clause doesn't give them an exemption to Buy America, that's great, and that'll prevent Canadian companies from moving their plants to to Mexico and shipping back into the USA. So, bottom line, please pass USMCA as fast as you can. Let's lock in the gains, but also let's continue to work to see if we can make this better as time moves on.
Thank you very much. On to Teamsters Canada, Mr. Benson.
Hi, good afternoon or good evening. Thanks for having us here. My name is Phil Benson, lobbyist Teamsters Canada, and with me is Christopher Manette, Director of Public Affairs. Teamsters Canada is Canada's supply chain union representing more than 125,000 workers in all sectors of the transportation industry and in all sectors of the economy, from film, food and beverage to dairy. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters represents 1.4 million workers. Teamsters Canada supports CUSMA and Bill C-4's timely passage. It is not the best deal. It is a deal, an achievement, given America's approach of bargaining in the best interest of its business, predicated on national security interests. Gains were made. However, by not understanding the fundamental nature and substance of negotiating trade agreements has changed, left opportunity off the table. Trade is important for many Teamsters' job. It is a reason why Teamsters Canada participated in every bargaining round during CUSMA's negotiation. The Liberal government made the right decision to include labor unions, NGOs, and civil society in the process. The practice of negotiating trade deals in secret is a factor in the growing disaffection of workers. Opening the door led in new perspectives, leading to a better outcome. Unfortunately, some departments did not get the memo. We were not a client, quote unquote, a client in their mind, and they often treated us as an afterthought. We anticipate this will change and will not happen again. The minister clearly appreciated and encouraged our activities in building support and consensus in Washington and Mexico City. Working with our colleagues and allies was helpful in achieving gains. It helped build support for a deal. Our International Brotherhood of Teamsters colleagues in Washington led the fight to make the improvements that led to a successful conclusion of the process in the United States. Those changes and the elimination of ISDS provisions are a win. During the Mexican round, we joined a civil society conference in the Mexican Senate, met with independent trade unions. Workers in the auto supply chain, in a closed-door session, told of unhygienic, inexcusable working conditions, testimony of violence and sexual assaults. I am proud of Teamsters and labor fighting for workers' rights everywhere, and of a government that got it. Trade agreements must include protection of workers, women, environment, Indigenous people, and C4 is a start in the right direction. The negotiators' liberalization trade bargaining blinders, seeking quote-unquote ambition, lost opportunity to protect Canadian jobs. For example, some jobs in rail and road transportation. It's a loss. Buy America in the position at whim of tariffs left unchecked, a pushback. The 6-year review, a sunset clause, is counter to why trade deals are entered. A confirmation the negotiating trade is no longer all about quote-unquote ambition, and it does offer potential future risk and opportunity. The provisions of NAFTA are not used by many sectors. The rules of origin are more expensive to comply with than to pay the costs of low or zero-based tariffs, and we do not believe that will change. As such, the NAFTA negotiations were driven by the United States' goal to protect American-based auto manufacturing and to dismantle Canada's supply-side management system. We'll push it, you know.
Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You may know the Teamsters Union. We are the largest transport sector union. You may not know, however, that we are also the largest union in the milk business. We represent about 5,000 workers in dairy products throughout the country and about 500 workers in the transport dairy industry from Vancouver, Ireland to Labrador and Newfoundland. Our union does support supply management. We recognize the efforts undertaken by the government to protect supply management. The fact that we could not push back the American effort to dismantle supply management, that we did push it back, was a gain for us. However, it was a loss that greater foreign access to Canada's dairy market was granted.
Most potential impact on dairy workers in isolation. Canada has repeatedly tossed the dairy sector under the bus in an effort to secure trade agreements. The impact of CITA, the CPTPP, and CUSMA on the sector is cumulative and severe. Close to 10% of the Canadian dairy market has been sacrificed on the altar of these free trade agreements. This at a time when domestic demand for milk has been steadily falling. The government recognized the need to compensate the dairy industry as a result. Let me be clear. We are in complete solidarity with dairy farmers, and we are not opposed to companies in the dairy processing sector receiving money either. The problem we call to your attention is that actual dairy workers are getting nothing. No money for training or skills upgrading, no enhanced EI or severance for workers who lose their jobs. Zéro puis une barre. This year, Saputo announced it will lay off 300 workers after receiving $7 million from the Dairy Processing Investment Fund. These laid-off workers will receive nothing from a government which has seen fit in recent years to give billions to literally every other player in the industry. Worse still, the government's subsidies might not even create or secure other jobs in the sector, as the funds can be used to automate production lines, potentially causing even more job losses. Trade agreements are viewed as one cause in the rise of the disaffection of workers. What do you think dairy workers, and everyday working-class Canadians in general, might think when industry is given billions and workers get nothing? Our thinking at this stage is that a program for the 25,000 workers employed in the dairy processing sector could cost less than 1% of the $3.9 billion earmarked for sectors affected by recent trade agreements in the spring 2019 federal budget. The good news is that Teamsters Canada has held some discussions at the departmental level. It is at an early stage, and it came only after years of effort. We ask that the committee support our initiative. As a matter of policy, we should no longer assume money given to an industry will automatically trickle down to workers. It is a sound position that when a government decides it must compensate an industry due to the effects of entering into a trade agreement, that compensation must include a package for actual workers. Alors, ceci étant dit, we'd welcome any questions the committee might have. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Carey.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I really appreciate you being here on short notice. This is such an important agreement, and maybe I'd like to start off with Mr. Sabat. When you said pass this quickly, I think everybody around the table, we want to make sure that this does pass, but we want to make sure we do our due diligence, because with any of these agreements, there are some families, some businesses, and some sectors that are negatively affected. And you even mentioned yourself the challenges with the Buy American situation. And Mr. Benson mentioned that there were some lost opportunities. And we've heard from other sectors, whether it's softwood lumber, Buy American, by signing on to this, we kind of are losing some leverage that we could have had. And that's a concern. You mentioned that Mexico may have an exemption to Buy America at the 3211, and that concerns me, particularly when it seems in the past we were able to negotiate an exemption. So I was wondering, how can that be? Like, what have you seen yourself or heard from other industry colleagues regarding why we weren't able to get those exemptions? Like, was it a priority for the negotiators, or what exactly happened? Did you hear anything?
That's a very good question. I recall back in 2009, 2010, the government was very interested in getting industry's input on Buy American, and we participated very fully in that initiative. And Canada did get an exemption in 2010. I think it was February 2010. This time out, we didn't hear very much. When we went to our one of our associations, the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, they said Buy America wasn't on the table, essentially, because the Americans had an outrageous request that they'd only allow Canadian companies to access procurement for the month of January. In February to December, we weren't allowed. Our negotiating team thought they better just not talk about that and focus on other things. And thankfully, at least that whole notion of we only had January as an opportunity went by the wayside, because when the papers came back, it was a checklist. You asked for this, we gave you this. They compared the checklists. What essentially happened is Mexico, I think, was in the driver's seat in terms of negotiations, and we sort of had to agree at the last minute.
Yeah, well, that's a problem. I had the opportunity. I was down in Washington, and we did have we had 5 premiers down there, and basically they were talking about infrastructure and the importance of having access, but both sides, because many of these businesses, such as yours, are very integrated. And for cost effectiveness, like you said, some things made in the American factory, some in the Canadian. And I just see this as a lost opportunity, unfortunately. But I think the premiers are taking a leadership role, trying to get down and reduce some of those barriers. But when we're looking at our overall competitiveness, I think everybody is happy that we do have an agreement in place and we do have some rules. But I wanted to ask, I think it was Ms. Hatch, you talked about some unique Canadian regulations relative to the United States. And I come from Oshawa, okay, and we just lost our plant. So regardless of certainty with this agreement, unfortunately, there were things that we weren't able to keep that plant operating as a assembly plant. We may have some parts and things along those lines, but you mentioned this Energy Star rating that is a unique Canadian, if the government goes ahead and says all appliances have to have this rating, it's just going to be something that is not the same rules in the United States and Mexico. So I was wondering how that is going to affect manufacturers, because I remember years ago there was intention for all these unique automotive regulations in Canada, and some manufacturers basically said to me, look, if we can't sell it in Canada, we're not building it in Canada, so you guys better get it together. What's it like with your association, and if we get these unique Canadian environmental regulations in that may not even make that much of a difference, but what does it do to the jobs and the ability to be competitive in North America?
Well, it'll potentially have an impact on affordability, and it will significantly reduce the consumer choices here in Canada, because it will be around 41% to 75% of the appliances that are on the market right now just won't be available, and that's in less than 2 years. So that's significant. I just want to go back.
Do you have numbers too on what percentage of appliances are made in Canada that would not be able to fulfill any of these new requirements unique to Canada?
Built in Canada. I mean, we don't have the specific numbers of products of manufacturing. Most manufacturing is done either in the U.S. and in Mexico and brought into Canada. But just to what Megan was speaking, it's the majority. It's the 41% that won't be compliant with Energy Star, and those are usually the entry level products. So it's like your top mount refrigerators with the freezer on the top, and it's your top load washers where you open the drum is on. You open the door at the top. Those are usually the entry level products that everyday Canadians, or the usually the middle class or lower income Canadians will purchase, and those are not necessarily Energy Star. So those will not be non-compliant right away.
Now, you mentioned the Regulatory Cooperation Council. Oh, well, basically, it seems that am I out of time, Suk?
You got 15 seconds. Well, now you have 8 seconds.
Okay, sorry. We'll go ahead. I'll give it to Suk then. Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Reyes next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Volpe, you mentioned that the increase in local content and the $16 average or minimum wage will increase investment in Canada. Yesterday we had Association of Steel Producers and Association of Aluminum Producers. They too use the words increase in investments. But when you dig deeper, aluminum industry has not seen any new smelter investments in the last 15 years. The steel industry, 20 years back they were producing 16 million tons. Now they are doing 15 million tons. So when they talk about increase in investment, they don't usually mean increase in investment to increase the capacity. So when you use the word increase in investment, are you referring to the increase in capacity?
Yes. The current NAFTA rules say if you want to sell a car to a consumer in any of the three countries, 62.5% of that car and 60% of qualifying parts have to come from that region. The way that we do it is we track 29 parts components.
So basically you're saying that we are going to increase the capacity to manufacture that's additional products that are required, correct?
$6 to $8 billion of incremental purchases in automotive supplies manufactured in Canada annually at full transition from a baseline of $35 billion.
Good, thank you. Mr. Sobo, the pipe manufacturing, because of the nature of this product, which is voluminous, I don't think you export outside of the North American market, correct?
No, we export to 66 countries.
Good. Then whenever the Buy American model comes in, you want us to have a fund ready to help, which is a good thing. But why don't we focus on more diversification of the markets?
No amount of exports will replace the American market.
What about the growing market in Asia and other countries?
They're taken care of by companies that are there already.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Mr. Benson, this agreement, will it lead to increase in number of your members?
It would be
the union membership, if I'm not wrong, is actually decreasing.
Actually, not for the Teamsters. We're constantly maintaining or growing. One of the few unions that is, partly because we are in the transportation sector. It's very hard to tell without having market studies to understand what's going on. All trade agreements, there's wins and losses. Often, when an agreement is done, it's later at a later date you find out if it's successful. One of the confusing things, if you look at dairy, and it's something that comes up, is that just because a company can't do something under CUSMA doesn't mean they can't do it under CPTPP. Or as we're negotiating Mercosur and Free Trade of the Americas, we'll end up with countries like Mexico with perhaps 3 or 4 trade agreements. So the answer is we don't really know because it is becoming so complicated.
Yeah.
But we will grow.
Dairy, just a comment, not a question. Maybe a question too. If we don't allow other countries to export into our market, how can we ask other countries to open their market for our products?
We have a supply management system. America has their subsidy as supply. But here, I'll give you one thing we raised just for a moment. The suggestion was, would you please get rid of your subsidies and we'll get rid of ours? And their answer was, their answer was no.
Whether it is Europe, whether it is Asia Pacific, the question always remains.
I know.
That you don't export to our market, but open your markets to us.
In
any case, I got only 45 seconds left. Ms. Hatch, you mentioned, from your talk, it almost appeared that going for Energy Star is bad. I have to disagree. I think we should focus more of our products going to Energy Star. I look forward for information on what percentage of those products that will not be available are actually manufactured in Canada. That you said you don't have, but you can always send us later. Amongst the manufacturers based in Canada, what percentage of their products are Energy Star qualified?
So Canada is a net importer of appliances.
I'm just talking about the manufacturers here.
Yeah, so nothing is manufactured in Canada.
Sorry?
Nothing is actually manufactured in Canada.
There you go. Then what is the point in having the manufacturer in your name?
We still have a huge industry here. There are all of our companies are located in the 905 area. I'm not going to name them, but we have 50 companies that I represent in Canada here.
Basically,
it also affects
distributors?
retail. It also affects retail. We have distribution centers across the country.
The
They're
point
sold
is
in
that,
every store. They're in every home. It's a huge industry.
The point is that there are no manufacturers in Canada that will be affected by Canada going for Energy Star.
No, but consumer choice will be affected.
Consumers' choice and energy requirements, consumption of lower consumption of energy is important too.
It's very strange that a ministerial mandate letter is tied to an American government-owned run program. That just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to our industry whatsoever.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Savard Tremblay.
Oui, alors.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming here. First question directed at Mr. Beasley. Did I pronounce your name correctly, sir? Thank you, and my apologies. In your presentation, you focused heavily on trade and new environmental concerns. Do you and does your association find that this new agreement is desirable? The Paris Accord as well?
I believe that fundamentally the answer to a good portion of our environmental challenges that may or may not be the issues that they are and how they're being presented, that we have pollution problems that need to be dealt with. We must, as a society, be competitive. We must have public policy that encourages those technologies to be able to be proliferated. As I mentioned in my presentation, I believe fundamentally that the best that Canada can do is to develop superb environmental technologies that the rest of the world can confidently adopt. It is that leadership, rather than punitive taxation, that's the leadership that Canada can show and that the leadership that Canada should show.
Mais dans tous les cas, il reste tout d'abord l'accord.
Well, the Paris Accord isn't in any way tied to COSMA, but as far as today's topic is concerned, is there anything that would disproportionately affect one country that was a signatory to the Paris Accord as opposed to another country that was not?
Thank you very much for your question. What I'm referring to in my presentation is the need for Canada to be strategic in this discussion of free trade. What we need to recognize is who we are relative to who the Americans are. We're dealing with the elephant in the room. If Canada, and just straight up, if we adopt carbon taxation, which our Prime Minister and our Deputy Prime Minister has acknowledged is not going to accomplish anything for us environmentally, that is only going to cause harm to the competitiveness of our households, our municipalities, and our businesses. I believe that history has shown that there's a better way potentially to solve this environmental challenge. If it is truly an environmental challenge that we believe society has, if we truly believe that it's an existential threat to society, if we were to look back and using the acid rain example of an accord between the United States and Canada, and perhaps using the free trade agreement to be able to foster that, great things environmentally were accomplished. Canada must be competitive. We must look at this from a strategic perspective, and at the end of the day, to hobble our society with taxation that the Americans have no intentions of adopting. We're already behind the eight ball in terms of our manufacturers, in terms of our municipalities, our households, and quite frankly, society in general. We must look at this in an entirely different way, and I believe it's crucial that we do.
Votre point de vue est
Your point of view is very clear and straightforward. I thank you for expressing it. Now, turning to another issue, Mr. Monette from the Teamsters, please. If I've understood correctly, product producers that don't have any other associations, well, you're an umbrella organisation for dairy producers, for example. Yes, indeed. agro-foods, and other kinds of producers, Saputo, for example. And what about the elimination of Clause 7, given that processors for a long time have been debating this issue? For example, filtered milk, some decided to ban it much more earlier, before it became a hot button political issue. So I'm just wondering what your position on that was, for example. Well, I'll defer to my colleague.
Yeah, the issue of that was America had used the dye-filtered milk as the way to get around importation of milk into Canada, basically because it wasn't in NAFTA. And the government put in a plan and a process so it would work, and that was really what set the Americans off. Was really as if you like, there's no countervail, just using our product at home. I think it was a good idea, supported that both the producers and the industry got some value out of it, especially the dairy farmers.
One second. Translation.
Well, as you're aware, the agreement was on Class 7, and Class 7 is eliminated under the current new agreement, correct?
Yeah, I think the TRQs were just done, and the difference is most of the import now of the dairy milk will be coming. We've got the 10% cap now, so it's changed. And as I understand it, most of the TRQs will be given to dairies, which helps dairies but does not help dairy farmers. If we can talk later, if more, we'll give you a written answer directly from our dairy division.
Thank you very much. Time is up, Mr. Savard Tremblay. On to Mr. Blakey.
Thank you, Mr. Sabot from IPEX. I have to say, as a construction electrician by trade, I've installed a lot of your product in the Winnipeg area, and I just wanted to follow up with you on some of your comments about Buy America. I know we've had a bit of discussion about this already, but we also have a bus manufacturer in my riding, New Flyer Industries. A lot of their production goes to the United States. Over 90% of their sales are with American municipalities. It's not going to happen in this agreement because it didn't. What are some of the instruments, or what are some of the things that you think we need to pursue in order to gain some kind of protection from the Buy America policy shifting jobs to the U.S.? I know there was a meeting of governors recently. Unfortunately, Manitoba's Premier Brian Pallister chose to stay home and not send anybody on his behalf. But is there opportunities at the province to state level or Canada to state level to try and have agreements that would allow Canadian companies to compete for that work?
Mr. Blakey, perfect question. In fact, that's what some of the provinces are doing. There is an opportunity for every province to have an agreement with the states. There's 37 states that are most crucial to us. And Ontario is doing that right now. Quebec is doing that. A lot of the products that we make in Quebec, actually, we ship into the United States. There's seismic resistant pipes there for earthquake areas. Like, it's hard to believe, but Quebec made in California is being shipped. Pipe made in Quebec is being shipped to California. Because it's unique, new to the world, all that sort of stuff. There are many opportunities for province to state agreements, and we're hoping that might alleviate some of the problem. However, we should always be looking for ways to work with our biggest customer, America, in order to see what they want and they need, and maybe we can come up with some sort of agreements in the future as well, federally. Right.
Thank you very much. To the Teamsters, I know you mentioned the word ambition, and I know that that's sometimes the word used to characterize Canadian trade policy. But when it comes to dairy, there's some pretty explicit, first-of-its-kind bans on the export of dairy product out of Canada, not just to the trading partners that are covered by the agreement, but to anywhere in the world. And I'm wondering how you think that squares with an ambitious export agenda.
Certainly isn't ambitious. One of the problems is, dairy was thrown to the tubes. It's not a trading issue. The government decided that they ponied up $3.9 billion, and according to the minister, if I heard her right, listening to her testimony when she was here, said they were going to do one for CUSMA as well. It's just that workers were left behind. The problem with ambition is working with their partners and allies in Mexico and the United States, we're working on a deal between Mexico and the United States that Canada can sign on. Some on rail issues, some on roads, some minor, some larger. But Canada wouldn't go there because it wasn't ambitious. And so we're negotiating with somebody who's looking after their own interests and the interests of their nation. But as I talked about, the blinders. And we're just asking they take those blinders off and realize that we're not negotiating under some theoretical construct of a university professor in a white tower, ivory tower. This is a real issues that dealing with real jobs, real people, and to discount things and ignore things because it doesn't fit into your theoretical notion of ambition in this modern world that we're moving into is just, I think, sad. It's sad. And also, I think when somebody asked a question, it was about fear. What I smelt in the room, I've done a little bit of bargaining and I smelt fear. And the fear was, at least at some level, the negotiators did not want to raise issues because they did not want in any way to upset the apple cart to get a deal. And congratulations, they got a deal. We need a deal. We support the deal. And all in, it's a good deal. But these are things, lessons we have to learn. It's a message to global and a message of how people bargain these deals to realize that, if you like, the old way of doing things in secret, in silence for 30 years, and I started with FTA. We were talking about, I go back to FTA. And at that time, we had full access to everything. It was amazing. This is a little bit better. We're cracking the door. But just look what happened. I support Brother Hussein Yusuf's statements yesterday. It's why we didn't go over all of that again. You've got people coming here from labor and NGOs and others saying, all in all, it's a deal. But maybe in 6 years, we get to review it with somebody else. Maybe we can clean some of these things up and get a better one. The risk is having it there. So that's what ambition's all about. It's just, it's not an insult or slam. It's just the world has changed. Please take them off. We're working on Mercosur now and the FTA. There's a few others we're actually working on. Same thing. Some I think might be very exciting, very supportable. But sometimes you have to take it off and make sure that people like Mr. Sabot here and other companies, maybe don't be scared to stand up or stand up for us in labor to protect our interests. It's okay to do it. Everybody else is doing it, especially America. Why shouldn't we too?
Oh, thank you very much. If I have a little bit more time, I'll use it.
You have 40 seconds.
Okay. Ms. Hatch, just really quickly, maybe we'll get a chance to follow up, but I am curious to know, we started talking a little bit about where the manufacturing happens, whether it's in Canada, US, or Mexico. We've talked a little bit about the committee about some better labor provisions and particularly labor oversight in Mexico. And I'm wondering if you could speak to how that might affect your members and what they think, if there's an opportunity for any of that work to come to Canada, or if Mexico's just such a low wage economy that most of the manufacturing is going to stay there.
I mean, yeah, there's definitely opportunity for manufacturers to come back to Canada. There's actually a couple companies that are moving some of their manufacturing back to Canada in the Gulf area, actually. So it is definitely opportunity, and that's one of the reasons why we definitely do support CUSMA and labor provisions there as well.
Okay, thank you all very much. On to Mr. Shields. Welcome to our committee today.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll be sharing my time with Mr. Holbach. But thank you for panelists for being here today. Really appreciate it. Always learn a lot from panelists that come. But Mr. Beasley, you talked about an agreement that was a cross-border agreement that I think very few of us know much about when you talked about carbon sequestration, but yet you also talked about the deal between Saskatchewan and U.S. states. Could you just explain that a little bit more? Because that's cross-border. This is what we're talking about in this agreement.
Absolutely, Mr. Shields, and thank you very much for the question. So it was on February 12th of 2017 where there was an accord between the Saskatchewan government, SaskPower, and the governors of the Wyoming, North and South Dakota, and Montana to proliferate technology that was actually within the Quebec pension plan, technology called CanSolve. And it was the first attempt at massive carbon capture from a coal-fired power plant. And at the end of the day, this became very interesting to the world because they took that CO2 and they injected it into depleted oil reservoirs. So they were not only removing massive amounts of CO2 from our environment, but they were turning it into enormous wealth. As I mentioned in my presentation, they went through a record late last year and they have captured 3 million tons, which is the equivalent, ladies and gentlemen, one more time, of removing 750,000 vehicles off the road. This isn't putting in a 40-watt light bulb in your house. This is major step changes in terms of improvements to our environment and airborne emissions. So the United States they're not going to adopt Paris. They have no intentions of doing this. They've made that clear. But that does not mean that they have any less commitment to the environment. And what I'm trying to get across to this panel today is that perhaps what we should look at is follow the Americans' example. Let's work on this from a technological perspective. Let's perhaps expand these types of relationships into other areas, and that the environmental problems that we believe we have in society, these are the directions that we're going to be able to go ahead and solve these. Mr. Shields, with that announcement, Donald Trump apparently referenced that agreement in 2018, his State of the Union address. They also put $2 billion from the U.S. EPA into that strategic initiative. The Americans are now embarking upon some of the largest carbon capture projects in the world by far. And Canada originally had that. It was originally developed up at Suncor Energy up in Fort McMurray, Alberta. And by golly, that's the leadership that Canada can show. Carbon taxation, all it does is hobble us. Let's look at the examples of the past, acid rain. Let's look at public policy that deals with this in the megaton level rather than a 40-watt light bulb in your home. Did that answer your question, sir?
Yeah, and that's why the importance in working with the relationship, as you asked, why this agreement that we're talking about is important, building those relationships, as you say, with the biggest economy in the world.
You know, as Prime Minister Trudeau and Deputy Minister Chrystia Freeland has said, it does not matter. We could shut Canada down and we will accomplish nothing for the world's environment. Nothing. We need to realize that we must look at this from a strategic perspective. We must show the leadership. We've got really smart people in Canada. And if we were to unlock that economic, that technical, and that entrepreneurial spirit through public policy, we would show incredible leadership to the world.
Thank you, Mr. Beasley. Mr. Holbeck.
Thank you. I'm an electronics geek. One of my happiest days was down in Vegas at CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, and looking at all the new Internet of Things and appliances. And I'm just kind of curious, in this new agreement, Ms. Hatch, do we have the foundations to actually have regulatory harmonization, for lack of a better word, so that we can actually have products being built right across North America that can be used right across North America?
Yeah, so regulatory harmonization is our number one issue, for sure. It took Canada 10 years to catch up to the United States in terms of energy efficiency levels, which I mentioned in my presentation earlier. And this government has worked through the Regulatory Cooperation Council. They put in a lot of effort. So that's essentially NRCan and the Department of Energy get together and they look at ways that they can make harmonization matter. And it's through that process that you're going to get more energy efficiency standards. So it's a continuous improvement. Each government can set more strict energy efficiency standards, and they will do that over time. And we've seen this. A lot of our products have gone through many iterations of this process, and now we have products that are very energy efficient. For example, a modern refrigerator uses less energy than a 60-watt light bulb for an entire year. So this has been a huge success. The Energy Star program is separate from that process, and I want to make sure that that's clear and people understand that today. That is a competition that manufacturers go through to try to be the best of the top 20-25%, and that also moves over time. And so through those two processes, the continuing more strict mandatory or minimum energy efficiency standards and this Energy Star thing, that's where you get more energy efficiency savings.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Just one quick, Mr. Sabat, I understand you had to lay some people off because of the blockade. I want you to know they're in our thoughts and prayers, okay?
Yeah, not laid off yet. However, there's 4 plants that are going down because we don't have any raw material. Langley, Clarkson, Pharmacy in Toronto, and I just have up-to-the-minute emails on that right now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sebo. Thank you. Mr. Sheehan.
Was that me? Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to thank Sook for thanking the staff. They play a very important role. We talk about Team Canada all the time, and we've been down to Washington a number of times, and our staff have been down there too as well. And we talk about the unions and industry working together, and the NGOs. I just also want to recognize that. And Sook's son has turned 16 today. So thank you for being here. You know, we all have family that we think about every now and then. Argon is 16, so we might be driving a car right now. So, so that's a little segue into my first question. And we've been thinking a lot about things. We've heard a lot when we were down in Washington. We talked about, you know, the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. I'm co-chair of the All-Party Steel Caucus, and I was there prior to the 232s and after. And I remember talking with, and I won't name him and name names since we're not naming names, but a Democrat. And he said, you know, that was 26 years ago. He said that he was around then. He said, I voted against the free trade agreement, voted against it. And he had said, and I remember it too. I was, you know, much younger then. Hair was a little darker. And I had noticed there was a lot of trepidation, fear, if you will, about job losses in Canada, and including around the auto sector. So my question is to you, starting with you, and so that same Democrat said he voted against it then. He said, I'm voting for it this time because I see how important it is and see the integration of the market. Like Algoma Steel ships 60% of its steel into the manufacturing sector, into appliances and into auto. They source all their materials from about 4 or 5 states, coal and steel. So starting with you, what's different today than it was then in not having the fears, and how does this agreement secure Canadian jobs?
So I think I know what you're talking about. The original agreement happened at a time when about 80% of the vehicles made in North America were made in the Great Lakes region. And so then it was the idea, hey, look, if I'm in a Great Lakes state and we're opening the door to Mexico or Canada, there's going to be some erosion. And so that's why he voted against it. This time, the agreement raises the regional value content, but also turns around specifically on vehicle parts on a section called core parts and says, and these are the 6 most added value parts, the ones you think they are: engines, transmissions, suspensions. If you're going to use steel to make those parts, or you're going to use aluminum to make those parts, 70% of that has to be sourced regionally. So simply, if he is representing a district that's in the automotive manufacturing sector or in steel, this agreement favors those regions. And specifically with the provision for labor value content. So if you make a car in a facility that pays less than $16 an hour, that's the wage, that's not the fully loaded cost of labor, then 40% of that car has to come from parts facilities that pay $16 an hour, which presumably, if they're making those core parts, are making it with 70% local steel. So it's really simple binary decision for anybody who's in a manufacturing district or riding. Automotive, steel, aluminum. This agreement guarantees more content than the one it replaces, and is the first one in 25 years for any of the 3 signatory countries that raises that number.
Thank you. Teamsters, maybe the same question.
Teamsters have always supported fair trade. And as a union, we have grown. There's an awful lot of our members who, quite bluntly, live and die by trade, railroads and et cetera. The dairy issue is an exception, and it's simply because, in this case, the only reason they'll be losing work potentially isn't because of regular trade, it's because the government's decided to allow access. And such, they're giving $3.9 billion plus to business, et cetera. All we're saying is a worker loses his job in that sector, which we're scared of or concerned about, there'd be some compensation for them. We're not asking for compensation for everybody. Whether it's in transportation, many of the other jobs, some jobs will be lost, some jobs will be won. Hopefully we'll win more than lose, and we'll continue to grow. It's a unique situation. It's a special situation. Building a fence around it, only for those industries when a government chooses to subsidize because of the trade. They know it hurts so bad. And I can only think of one case this has happened. It's this one. And we just think it's fair if to have something there just in case as an insurance program or a program for those workers, they have a little bit taken care of. Otherwise, trust me, we'll look after ourselves.
No doubt. Now, Chris.
Okay. Your time is up. On to Mr. Lewis. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and thank you very much to all of our witnesses. I'm gonna address this to Mr. Volpe. Sir, I listened very keenly to your opening remarks. Very well done, and a lot of quotes and a lot of dates, and because my riding down by Essex, of course, I continue to say it. So entrenched in the automotive industry, so very close to our border, the busiest international border, of course, in North America. I was listening again with keen interest. Just one quick date that I would bring to your attention, sir, was back April of 2019. That was a date that the United States lawmakers received an economic impact study to help them make decisions along their new NAFTA trade agreement along the way. That's one study that at least this side of the table has not saw as of yet. So we're very sure it's coming, but we haven't saw it as of yet. So I just wanted to bring that one date to your attention. And also just a couple of really quick quotes. And I got this from the CBSA website. The CBSA website currently states, and I quote, "The CBSA at this time will not be seeking additional resources to implement and administer the CUSMA," end quote. Goes on to read, "The CBSA will have to update policy and standard operating procedures, as well as identify new system and operational requirements. Should the implementation of new CUSMA benefits to the trade community add pressure on CBSA operations, resources needs will be reassessed to inform future recommendations to the Minister as appropriate." Sounds to me as though it's a little bit after the fact. But again, so I do acknowledge your enthusiastic support for the new NAFTA, sir, and there certainly does appear to be good news for the auto sector, and that, of course, is good news for workers and businesses in my riding of Essex. The focus of my questioning has not been on whether to ratify, but rather on implementation. The concern being that there is a very short 90-day window between ratification and implementation, which will be handled by the CBSA. The committee was advised that one of the most complicated elements of this agreement is the rules of origin, particularly in the auto sector. There are much more stringent rules in terms of content, and as well as labor value content threshold, which companies will now have to track throughout their supply chain. In your opinion, sir, does the CBSA have the tools and the training to make sure that they're ready to go on their front? And further, the need to ensure that our Canadian businesses and manufacturers, the ones that literally feed our families, aren't interrupted along the way. So I suppose I'm asking, again, in your opinion, have those tough questions been asked of our businesses and the government from your perspective?
The short answer is yes. Here's the longer answer. The timing is dictated by Washington. Washington has been in an absolute hurry because, of course, there's an election season, and the president would very much like to take credit for gains from his perspective on the USMCA. You know, we've asked the same questions of the CBSA. We have a standing committee of members with the CBSA that meets regularly. It's a two-part question. What's the excess capacity available at CBSA to process? They're not operating at 100% here, so there is some excess capacity. The second part is there is, even though the rules come into play at enforcement, which is the first day of the third month after ratification by this House, there's a 3-year ramp up on content levels. So you're going to have to track new product, but the level of that product is, the volume of that product is going to be stepped up over the course of 3 years. So it's a question, it's a real operating question that we've engaged the CBSA, but the CBSA fortunately has engaged industry rather directly on it.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So it was interesting you spoke about the first day of the first month, or of the third month. Sorry. So do you have any concerns that the CBSA is going to be ready for the first day of the third month? And have you heard any concerns about whether they're going to be ready to implement from, be it businesses or any other stakeholders?
Look, we work in a just-in-time business and on very thin margins, so we're always concerned. That's a matter of concern every day on whether the CBSA, from day to day, year to year, whether they're ready. The question will be when the uniform regulations get released. The description of parts in those agreements, if they match HS codes that are easily processed, then it's a swifter process. In the end, if, the product has to get into a vehicle into a truck or into a rail car and has to go across the border. There is a finite amount of product that can go through because there's a finite amount of hours in the day. The border is manned, so to speak, 24 hours a day. So we don't see that as the primary concern. It's a prudent question, especially given your riding. I spend a lot of time in your riding, got a lot of members in your riding, and they're all asking similar questions as you, which is, we're going to get access to about 25% more volume orders. Can we ship them, and can we fill them? I think the second question is the most important one, but the first one is prudent to ask.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dhaliwal.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Terry, for bringing up my son Arjun's 16th birthday. You know, even though I miss him, but we are doing a very important historic work right here in Ottawa, and I feel very proud. My first question is going to go to my friend Phil. Over the last many years, we have constructively worked together, and I want to thank the Teamsters members in my part of the world that they have helped me in past, and we had a very positive dialogue. And you mentioned particularly that Teamsters are big when it comes to transport industry. Yesterday we had a president of the Truckers Alliance here. He mentioned that this is very positive for the trucking industry. Would you agree, or would you tell me how this will help those Teamster members that are in the transport industry?
It's a fairly simple formula. We do, of course, trains, railroad, we're in airports, at ports, and couriers. So if you look at the modern world, the more volume there is, the more dollar volume there is, the faster it has to move. Means work, means jobs. So
you agree that this will create jobs?
Yeah, absolutely. In that hall. Of course, somewhere else we're not sure, but on the transport, that's why I keep saying we're going to be fine, is because in the modern world, if a union must be located somewhere, it's excellent. Of course, we do many other things. As you know, in British Columbia, film. They're doing very well in film. Free trade helps film. It kind of helps all our members who are in film to go through all their different, as you know, we do everything from ice wine to breweries to beverage to fruit juice and tomato sauce. All of these things, when they move, they cross borders. People want them. It means work for us. Also for trade. The more our pulses sell, the more our grain sells, it means work for us because we have to move it. So in all those aspects, it's a very good thing for many Teamsters jobs.
Thank you. And my next question is to Mr. Beasley. You mentioned that Canada, we have very smart, intelligent people here. Could you tell me how Canada can remain as a leader and an advocate for environment while pursuing all these trade deals?
If I was to look at the analogy of how we solved the acid rain problem, what we did was, as a government, we created public policy which stated to industry, these are the guidelines that you must meet. We gave industry the appropriate amount of time to work on the problem, to solve it. And we gave them the patience to have us understand that along the way, and along that technological development way, failure will happen. But if the goals are worthwhile, we use the lessons learned of failure and we continue to go forward and march forward, and eventually those failures will lead to success, which is exactly what happened when we had a very serious existential threat to our well-being within North America, which was acid rain. What we created was we created tax policies. I believe that government has no business making technological decisions. I believe that those with the best bona fide interest is industry and the technical representations of those industries together with universities and trade associations. What we would be able to do is, if we were to create public policy that unlocked that, unleashed that, encouraged industry, I'm comfortable in saying that great things would happen. If I use the analogy of the West, some people may have the impression that oilmen don't care very much about the environment. We care about drilling wells and perhaps producing oil and gas. Nothing could be further from the truth. For the last 30 years, 40 years, some of the best oilmen have been working on both sides, improving the ways to improve our energy intensity per barrel produced. back to your direct question, the best thing that we should do from a public policy perspective is to create the playing field, not make technological decisions. We don't need to make these investments. The investments that industry would make would be investments that would make them money together with solving those problems. And I guess what I would suggest, if you were to ask me specifically, as an expansion of the scientific research and experimental development potential, if we had generous status that industry could count on, let them make the decisions, but let them to be able to monetize their losses on the way to successes. Great, great things would be accomplished in our society. I have no doubt about that.
Okay, thank you very much. On to Mr. Savard Tremblay for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Perhaps I'll continue on that topic or on a topic that we lacked time for earlier. Mr. Monette, you brought up the issue of compensation subsidies not only to producers but also to the workers in the dairy sector. It's an idea that we don't hear as much of when it comes to producers. Under what form should that take place? What type of subsidies? In two ways. First, we need to ensure that before we get to the point where we're losing jobs, funds be available so that workers in the dairy sector can retrain, take courses, and really be able to work at the cutting edge of the industry. If a warehouse worker in the dairy processing sector, for example, is faced with job loss, it's possible that their employer could need them in another position, given the lack of manpower and labor at present, in particular in Quebec. And if funds were available, the employer might be able to keep that employee and simply retrain them, keeping them in the same organization. Now, it's likely that we won't be in a position to save all jobs. When layoffs are required, funds are needed then as well to ensure that enough employment insurance is available and that people receive proper departure packages. Sometimes employees have family members who, let's say, are diabetic or have other severe illnesses. It doesn't cost us that much, after all, to purchase an extension of a collective insurance program with the employee to ensure that such families aren't unduly penalized. And not to forget older workers. It might be possible to purchase a few extra pension years, allowing them to retire a little early. Doesn't cost that much to invest in a couple more years of pension pay. $5,000, $10,000 is about what it is in that sector.
I wanted to ask of Ms. Hatch and Mr. Kurt-Harry. We've been talking a little bit about some of the data provisions in NAFTA today, and I know that with smart home technology, there's a lot of data collection that goes on. Obviously, some of that data is to the benefit of the consumer in terms of things that they can do in their home, but there's another side to that data. Sometimes it's sold and commercialized by the industry. I'm wondering if you guys have given any thought to some of the data localization provisions and other kind of IT provisions or digital provisions in NAFTA, and if your industry has done any thinking about the potential cost and benefit to industry, but also potential cost and benefit to consumers.
Yeah, I mean, our industry is definitely looking at because appliances are more smart IoT. Our industry is definitely trying to be proactive in terms of that, not only just in terms of what data is being collected, it's data privacy, and following standards processes that are out there currently. NIST is one that comes to mind for me. We formed I guess a manufacturer task force with our association to look at that and to adopt the latest standards.
So does the localization of data figure into your industry's plan for the for the future at all? Is that something that you guys see as important for the protection of the privacy of your consumers, or is it something that you're not interested in? Or?
No, it's definitely on the table. It's definitely something that we're looking at, and it's definitely something it's very important to our manufacturers as well.
Does that data tend to live where the product is manufactured? Like, would a lot of Canadian consumers' data who purchase appliances from your companies have their data stored in the U.S. or Mexico already, or does that data tend to live here in Canada?
That's something I had to get back to you on.
Sure, yeah. If you'd follow up with
with
the committee in writing, that'd be great.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have finished this round. Do the members have any additional questions? Mr. Dhaliwal? Okay, no additional questions?
So may I get a few in if there is time?
There is time.
Okay.
If there's a few additional questions that the members have, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Although Mr. Dhaliwal spoke up first, so if he wants to go first, that's fine.
Question?
I have a question, but you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I have a couple of questions for Ms. Hatch. I was wondering if you could imagine for a minute that you're standing in a new Canadian home, complete with new appliances. Can you give us an idea of which of those appliances would disappear if the Energy Star became mandatory?
It targets all appliances, and actually appliance is not defined in it, so it could actually go beyond home appliances to electronics, anything under the Energy Star program right now.
And which appliances typically are under Energy Star?
Refrigerators, freezers, room air conditioners. Sorry, it's like clothes washers, clothes dryers, air cleaners, things like that.
Okay, so practically everything then,
Yes.
is that okay?
Yeah.
So, and I believe one of you said earlier this would primarily affect the lower cost appliances. Is that correct?
Yeah. So yeah, it's usually entry level products. We'll call them. Yeah, your top mount refrigerator, freezers, and your front load or your top load washers.
Okay, so maybe richer people who buy the most expensive top-of-the-line appliances wouldn't be affected so much, but the working class folk who are living paycheck to paycheck, it would affect them the most.
I mean, it's a consumer choice. So there'll be more options available. And Energy Star comes at a premium. So, yeah. So I mean, it's usually the entry level models are not Energy Star.
All right. And I believe one of you mentioned that Energy Star is a trademark of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Is that correct? And so if the Canadian government made Energy Star mandatory, and so is it the U.S. government who sets the requirements for Energy Star as well? For
Yeah,
qualifying?
that's right. So if we made everything Energy Star, it would be the end of the Energy Star program here in Canada.
Okay. And can you see any challenges in having a Canadian program comply with standards established entirely by a U.S. government department?
Yeah, I mean it's a voluntary program, and it's run by the U.S. EPA, and so currently, so they go through their whole standards process there, and there is depending on what happens to the program, it's voluntary, so it's operated by the U.S. government.
Okay, so if the U.S. government changes it at any time, Canada would have to follow in lockstep without any input. Is that accurate?
Yeah, if we're going to tie our regulations to Energy Star, then yes, that would be very strange because then they could just change them in the United States, and I guess we'd have to follow it. It just doesn't make any sense.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Dhaliwal?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank each and every one of you coming today as well and staying late evening. My question goes to all of you. How does this agreement create fairness for workers and small businesses when it comes to gender equality? And particularly when you see lots of businesses, small businesses are growing, is particularly owned by women. You want to start, Bill?
You always give me the hard questions. I want to say in this agreement, it's the first, and I credit the government for this, is that trade deals have to get away from just being so-called neutral in trade, and for the government to talk about to put labor issues forward, and they wanted to go farther, women's issues forward, and they wanted to go farther, Indigenous and et cetera, is that as we move forward, hopefully this will become the trend and more important. We have to have that balance in an agreement. Where it goes from there, I'm not sure, but full credit for fighting for it. I know we tried our best to push for it, but full credit for the government for bringing it. Where it goes with industry, as you know, we're fighting pay equity, all these other things. It's a separate field. Trade can't do everything. But, thank goodness it was looked at and became partial of a trade deal. And congratulations to the government for running with it. It's the only government in the country, in the world that I know of, that has pushed that. And so good for you.
Anyone else? Mr. Volpe, you?
Sure. Automakers, currently all automakers have mandates for sourcing from women-run suppliers. The agreements in the past have reduced the regional value contents or reduced supplies volumes that are bought from Canadian base supply. This one increases them. So indirectly here, it's a wider opportunity with more content coming from Canada and more suppliers, women-run suppliers, are able to bid into those car makers' purchases. Let me just say one more thing, Mr. Dhaliwal. We spoke of your son, 16 years old. Happy birthday. Some of you served with my father.
I did.
Right. I spent 16th birthday with him up here in Ottawa. My mother, who was going to university at the time, she went back to university, came home and made me a tiramisu. But we knew my father was doing honorable work, and it's a pleasure here to be with some of his colleagues. Thank you for calling me up time and again.
Thank you. Okay. You want to add something?
I mean, in regards to CUSMA, with the sectoral annexes and the other, it just levels the playing field for energy efficiency regulations. And regardless of the business, it just everyone has to follow the same rules to meet standards. So, in regards to businesses, whether they're in gender equality, it just levels the playing field for all. So.
I guess affordability can be tied into gender equality for sure, and we're saying that the Energy Star, making everything Energy Star is going to affect affordability. So,
Mr. PD?
Well, I'm really proud to say this. I mean, being someone who's 40 years in the oil and gas industry, gender has never been an issue. Some of the brightest, most exceptional people that I've met in my career throughout the world, gender had nothing to do with it, and ladies were as intelligent and as capable, and they were treated that way, and they rose to the top of the ivory towers. Some of them chose not to for family reasons. That's up to them. But the bottom line is I don't believe we've ever been. You're not going to see a gal out on a drilling rig spinning chain or flipping pipe or something like that. It's physically different. But as far as engineering, the legal, the accounting, all of those services, gender never did have anything to do with it. I'm proud to say that.
Sabo? Anything?
I'm an engineer. It's very tough for me to.
Me, an engineer too.
Yeah, to straddle that. All I can say is, Buy America, Buy American is the hugest threat to us. I think men and women will lose their jobs if Buy America is implemented.
Thank you
very much. Any further questions? Okay, everybody's good?
Maybe ask them if they have anything to add that they haven't added.
Fire today.
Sue's
on fire today.
You've had.
Hey, if you want to stay afterwards, yeah, that's.
You've had dinner, and some of us haven't had dinner. So I would think that at this point, maybe people, including the witnesses, would like to go to dinner. So thank you sincerely for coming and spending the time with us and for all your valuable comments. Meeting adjourned.